What if the greatest threat to America wasn't a foreign army, but itself? What if the fight for freedom meant facing your own brother, and the cost of justice was written in blood? The American Civil War was more than a clash of armies. It was the moment the United States was torn apart and forced to decide what kind of nation it would become. It began with a cannon blast at Fort Sumter, but its echoes are still felt today. This wasn't just a war between North and South. It was a war of ideas, of identity, of survival. In this 15-part journey, we'll walk through muddy battlefields, war rooms, slave quarters, and presidential halls. We'll hear the voices of soldiers, enslaved people, nurses, and leaders, each one a thread in the story of a country unraveling and being painfully reborn. We'll uncover how this war shaped everything, from our laws to our memories, and why its legacy remains unfinished. This isn't just a story about the past. This is the story of who we are. So buckle up. If this moved you, if history speaks to your heart, subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. And together, let's walk through the fire of America's greatest trial and see what still burns. Part 1. A House Divided, the Seeds of Disunion. There were once 13 fragile colonies that stood shoulder to shoulder against an empire, pledging life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what those men of 1776 could not have foreseen, what they could not even bear to imagine, was that barely 80 years later, that same union, forged in revolution and hardened by war, would teeter at the edge of oblivion. A fracture ran down the very spine of the young nation, one not of borders or battlefields, but of souls and beliefs. At its center burned the question of slavery, smoldering beneath the surface of compromise and courtesy until, at last, it erupted into the fire of civil war. The tale begins not in 1861 with cannon fire at Fort Sumter, but decades earlier, in quiet legislative halls and noisy printing presses, in plantation fields and factory floors, where two visions of America grew apart under the same flag. One vision clung to the old world, an agrarian aristocracy built on enslaved labor, deeply rooted in tradition and resistant to the tides of change. The other was modern, restless, industrialized, and increasingly shaped by ideals that saw slavery as a moral blight and a contradiction to the values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. These competing visions did not merely diverge, they collided again and again, until the Union forged in 1776 stood ready to fall apart. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the question of slavery was a devil's bargain written into the very fabric of the Constitution. The Founding Fathers, divided on the issue, had opted for silence over justice. To form a union, they left slavery intact. The infamous 3/5 Compromise, the 20-year moratorium on banning the slave trade, and the Fugitive Slave Clause. These were not mere political calculations. They were time bombs. By the early 19th century, the economic fates of North and South began to diverge sharply. In the North, industrialization surged forward. Immigrant labor flooded into cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Railroads, telegraphs, and textile mills transformed the region into a bustling machine of capitalism. Meanwhile, the South clung to cotton, the so-called white gold. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had supercharged the Southern economy, making slavery more profitable than ever before. King Cotton ruled the South, and the South ruled cotton. But cotton had its price. In the lush fields of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the Carolinas, millions of enslaved African Americans toiled beneath the sun, living under the lash, legally regarded as property. To the Southern planter class, Slavery was not a necessary evil but a positive good, defended from the pulpit, the press, and the Senate floor. Southern leaders built an entire ideology around it, one that cast the South as a bastion of Christian civilization, and the slave as both dependent and dangerous. To them, abolition was not only a threat to their economy, but to their very way of life. Meanwhile, abolitionism began to rise in the North, not as a wave, but a ripple that soon swelled into a moral crusade. William Lloyd Garrison, fiery and uncompromising, launched the Liberator in 1831 and declared that he would be heard. Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped the horrors of bondage, spoke with the thunderous eloquence of lived truth, humanizing a system many preferred not to think about. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin sold hundreds of thousands of copies, awakening the North to the emotional and moral reality of slavery. Southern states, in turn, saw these voices not as dissent, but as incitement. Politics soon mirrored the growing animosity. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, was the first major attempt to hold back the floodwaters. It drew an invisible line across the map, slavery below, freedom above. But lines on maps could not contain the fury. Each new territory added to the Union brought with it a battle over whether it would be slave or free. The Mexican-American War only made things worse. With vast new lands acquired in the West, the question returned with a vengeance. Would slavery expand or be contained? The answer did not come peacefully. In 1850, the Compromise of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster gave birth to the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring all Americans to return escaped slaves to their owners. For many Northerners, it was a final insult. Even those indifferent to slavery found themselves coerced into complicity. Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad grew bolder. Personal liberty laws sprouted across the North. Tensions rose like steam under pressure. Then came Kansas. If ever there was a spark that showed how near the country stood to the flame, it was Bleeding Kansas. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers to decide the slavery question for themselves via popular sovereignty. What followed was not democracy, but carnage. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to claim the territory for their cause. Armed clashes erupted, towns burned, and men were killed over the future of a land not yet a state. In one chilling moment, radical abolitionist John Brown led a brutal attack on pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek, hacking 5 men to death. Brown's sword was as unforgiving as his God. By now, the halls of Congress had become battlegrounds of their own. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a scathing speech denouncing slavery and its defenders. Days later, he was savagely beaten on the Senate floor by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Beaten so badly, he could not return to work for 3 years. The attack was celebrated in the South, condemned in the North, and symbolic of a nation unraveling. As the 1850s marched on, party politics fractured. The Whigs collapsed under the weight of internal division. The Republican Party was born in 1854 with one rallying cry: no extension of slavery into the territories. It was not yet the party of Lincoln, but it was the party of a changing America. The Democratic Party, once a unifying force, split along sectional lines. Moderation was dying. Extremism was on the march. And then, the nation met Abraham Lincoln. Tall, gaunt, with a face etched in melancholy and a mind sharpened by logic, Lincoln was a self-taught lawyer, a frontier philosopher, and a man uniquely shaped by contradiction. He opposed slavery, but did not call immediately for its abolition. He feared disunion above all else, yet believed the nation could not endure half slave and half free. When he ran for president in 1860, Southern leaders warned that his election would mean the end of their world. They were right, but not in the way they feared. Lincoln won without a single electoral vote from the Deep South. He was a minority president in a fractured land. Before he could even take office, South Carolina voted to secede. Mississippi followed, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Within weeks, the Confederate States of America was born, complete with its own constitution, president, and sense of purpose. They claimed it was about states' rights, but those rights centered on one issue: the right to own slaves. Lincoln, cautious and deliberate, watched as the nation came apart. He pledged not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but refused to accept the legality of secession. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he had once said. Now, the house had cracked straight down the middle. And still, there was no war. Not yet. The North, uncertain and unprepared, hoped for reconciliation. The South, bold and righteous in its cause, prepared for defense. For 4 months, the nation existed in a limbo between peace and war. In Charleston Harbor, a small Union garrison held out at Fort Sumter, surrounded by Confederate guns. Supplies dwindled. Tension grew. Letters flew back and forth. The world held its breath. Then, on April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, the Confederates opened fire. The barrage lasted 34 hours. Cannon thundered across the bay. Smoke rose over the ramparts. Major Robert Anderson held out as long as he could before surrendering. No one was killed during the bombardment, but that fact was immaterial. The war had begun, not over slavery alone, nor solely over states' rights, but over the very definition of the Union itself. In Washington, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. In Richmond, the call went out for resistance. Virginia seceded, then Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The country shattered. And so, a new chapter began, not of politics or compromise, but of battlefields, blood, and heartbreak. The road to Gettysburg, Appomattox, and the rebirth of the American soul would stretch long and grim ahead. But it began here, in the cracks of a divided house, where ideals collided and history demanded a reckoning. The storm had broken. The war had come. Part 2. The Union in Crisis, from Secession to Sumter. When the guns fell silent after the thunder of cannon fire at Fort Sumter, the illusion of a peaceful resolution was shattered like glass beneath an iron heel. But in truth, the road to that Charleston Harbor fort had been long, winding, and lined with every desperate effort to hold a crumbling Union together. The final days of the antebellum republic were filled with tension so thick it clung to the breath. The secession of Southern states was not a moment, but a movement, rippling outward from Charleston like shockwaves from an earthquake, leaving Washington reeling, the North uncertain, and the South galvanized. In these months between election and war, history teetered on a knife's edge. It was in December of 1860, in the immediate wake of Abraham Lincoln's election, that the first great crack split the Union. South Carolina, that firebrand of secessionist energy since the nullification crisis 3 decades earlier, became the first state to officially secede from the United States. On December 20th, in a unanimous vote, its convention declared the bonds of union dissolved. They did not merely leave the Union, they denounced it, asserting that the federal government had become hostile to their rights and institutions, foremost among them the institution of slavery. This was no abstract legal argument. South Carolina's secession ordinance and the declarations of causes that followed from other states made it unequivocally clear slavery lay at the heart of the rupture. The election of Lincoln, who had run on a platform that opposed the extension of slavery into new territories, was seen not as a political loss, but as a mortal threat. The South had long warned that a Republican victory would spell disunion. Now they made good on that threat. Over the following weeks, 6 more Deep South states followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Each issued its own ordinance of secession. Mississippi declared, in chilling clarity, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." These declarations were not crafted in haste or confusion. They were deliberate, methodical, and rooted in years of political grievance and fear of marginalization within a changing American landscape. In the North, confusion reigned. The sitting president, James Buchanan, still held office until Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, and in those crucial weeks, the Union had no effective leadership. Buchanan, a man widely regarded as weak and indecisive, insisted that while states had no right to secede, the federal government also had no constitutional power to stop them. In effect, he did nothing. His inaction emboldened the South and infuriated the North. Cabinet members resigned, federal arsenals were seized by Southern militias, and yet the White House remained paralyzed. The nation was hemorrhaging, and its doctor refused to operate. In the seceded states, enthusiasm burned hot. Crowds cheered the lowering of U.S. flags from government buildings and the raising of new banners bearing palmettos, stars, and bars. Militias drilled in public squares. Politicians issued fiery declarations of independence, invoking the legacy of the Revolution. But beneath the surface of jubilation was uncertainty. Could these fledgling states truly form a new nation? Would the Upper South follow the Deep South's lead? Would the North really let them go without a fight? By February 1861, representatives from the seceding states convened in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new government, the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution that mirrored the U.S. model in many respects, but made explicit protections for slavery and states' rights. They chose as their president Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War, who accepted the post with solemn dignity and a conviction that the Southern cause was righteous. Davis was no firebrand. He was a military man, cautious and principled, but fully committed to the preservation of the Southern way of life. Even as the Confederate government took shape, there were efforts, tenuous and desperate, to avoid war. One such attempt was the Crittenden Compromise, proposed by Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden. It would have restored the Missouri Compromise line and protected slavery in the South by constitutional amendment. Lincoln, however, would not accept any plan that allowed the extension of slavery into new territories. For him, such a concession would not preserve the Union but betray its soul. Into this maelstrom stepped Abraham Lincoln, inaugurated on March 4, 1861, beneath overcast skies and the watchful presence of soldiers. Washington, D.C. was a city on edge. Rumors of assassination swirled. Armed men guarded the president-elect. His inaugural address was an attempt at healing, a plea for unity and reason. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Yet, he was clear in one respect: the Union was perpetual, and he would preserve it. Secession, he declared, was legally void. In the weeks that followed, Lincoln moved cautiously. He understood that war, if it came, must be seen as a response, not an initiation. He hoped to hold the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, within the Union. These were slaveholding states that had not yet seceded, and their loyalty could tilt the balance of power. If they joined the Confederacy, the Union might be lost. If they remained, it could be saved. But beneath Lincoln's measured words, a crisis loomed. In Charleston Harbor, the Union garrison at Fort Sumter was running out of supplies. Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian by birth but loyal to the Union, had moved his small force into the fort after South Carolina's secession, judging it more defensible than other positions in the harbor. The Confederacy demanded the fort's surrender. Anderson held firm. The fort became a symbol, a last, flickering outpost of federal authority in the seceded states. Lincoln faced a terrible dilemma. To abandon the fort would be to legitimize secession. To reinforce it could provoke war. After deliberation, he chose a middle path: send ships to resupply the garrison with food and provisions, not arms. It was a brilliant maneuver, forcing the Confederacy to choose whether to initiate hostilities or allow the federal flag to fly in defiance. Jefferson Davis, after conferring with his cabinet and military commanders, made the fateful decision. The Union would not be permitted to remain at Sumter. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire at 4:30 a.m. The night before, Charlestonians had filled rooftops to watch the expected bombardment as if it were a festival. The attack thundered across the harbor, shells arching through the pre-dawn sky. The fort returned fire but was hopelessly outgunned. After 34 hours, Major Anderson surrendered. There were no fatalities during the bombardment, but war had arrived. In the North, the response was immediate and electric. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Crowds surged into recruitment centers. Flags flew in every northern city. Even those who had counseled compromise now rallied to the flag. The Confederacy, in turn, saw Lincoln's call to arms as an act of aggression. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, seceded in protest. The Upper South, which had hesitated, now chose sides. Richmond became the Confederate capital. The line was drawn. Washington transformed overnight. The city swarmed with troops. Earthworks sprang up. Regiments from Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania poured in, their uniforms new and buttons still gleaming. Maryland teetered on the edge, with Baltimore erupting in violence as pro-Confederate mobs attacked Union troops passing through. For a moment, even the capital itself seemed vulnerable. But the Union held, and in the South, men poured into Confederate ranks with fervor. Drums beat through town squares. Young boys lied about their age. Old men lied about their health. The South believed it could win quickly, that its superior military tradition, knowledge of terrain, and presumed moral righteousness would carry the day. "All we ask is to be let alone," Davis had said. But the South had not been let alone. It had fired the first shot. Thus began a war that neither side fully understood. In the opening weeks, both imagined a short conflict. "I looked forward to a brisk, brief campaign," wrote one Union volunteer. "I was certain the rebels would run at the first sight of our bayonets." He would soon learn otherwise. The South, too, expected swift glory. One Virginian wrote to his fiancée, "We shall beat the Yankees in one grand battle, and then come home to applause." He would not return. The Union now faced its greatest test. Lincoln, who had once hoped merely to preserve the Union, now saw that something deeper was at stake. If democracy could not survive secession, it might not survive at all. The founders had built a republic. The war would determine whether it could endure. And so, with flags waving and drums rolling, with poetry on their lips and muskets on their shoulders, the armies marched, not yet understanding the cost of what lay ahead. What had begun as a political crisis had become a war of destiny. The American Republic stood divided, and the blood had only just begun to flow. Part 3. Call to Arms. The war begins. They came with drums, with flags, and with laughter. They came in columns, young men from New York and Ohio, from Mississippi and Georgia, from Missouri farm towns and South Carolina plantations, all marching beneath the sun with a swagger that only the unblooded can afford. In the heady months following Fort Sumter, the American Civil War did not yet carry the odor of death. It wore, instead, a carnival face. Across both the Union and the Confederacy, the call to arms swept through towns and cities like wildfire, igniting hearts and stirring ancient ideas of honor, duty, and glory. The war had begun not just with cannon and proclamations, but with parades, hymns, and promises that it would all be over by Christmas. The North surged with patriotism in the days after Lincoln's call for volunteers. From Boston to Chicago, from Philadelphia to Indianapolis, men rushed to enlist. Recruiting offices overflowed, militia halls burst with noise, and factories converted overnight to produce arms, uniforms, and tents. Newspapers trumpeted the Union cause as a righteous crusade against rebellion. Women sewed flags and made bandages. Children drilled with wooden rifles in imitation of their fathers and older brothers. The romantic spirit of 1776 seemed to return, though few yet grasped the grim reality of what war in the industrial age would become. In the South, the fervor was just as intense, if not more so. Secession had crystallized into resistance, and resistance into defiance. States raised regiments in days. Courthouses echoed with speeches extolling liberty and Southern rights. Young men wrote letters of farewell soaked in the language of chivalry, invoking God and home and the sacred soil of Dixie. The Confederacy, though new and fragile, was ablaze with martial pride. Like their Union counterparts, these recruits believed the war would be short. The Yankees, they said, were soft and cowardly. A single decisive battle, a single great charge, and the South would win its independence. But it was not merely the soldiers who mobilized. Entire societies transformed almost overnight. Industry, transport, agriculture, and governance all shifted to a war footing. In the North, railroads became arteries of the war effort, ferrying troops and supplies with astonishing speed. Telegraph wires crackled with military orders. Arms manufacturers ramped up production, and the federal government, long minimalist and distant in daily life, now loomed as a commanding force. The Treasury issued paper money, greenbacks, for the first time, and Congress authorized unprecedented levels of taxation and spending. In the South, the Confederate government worked feverishly to create from scratch a bureaucracy capable of waging modern war. Richmond, newly named the Confederate capital, bustled with energy and confusion. Jefferson Davis faced monumental tasks, organizing an army, forging alliances, issuing currency, managing logistics, and uniting states that prided themselves on individual sovereignty. The Confederacy, in theory, was a union of sovereign entities. In practice, it would require central authority, and therein lay tensions that would plague the Southern war effort from the outset. Meanwhile, both sides grappled with the sudden enormity of what they had unleashed. Neither the Union nor the Confederacy had standing armies capable of large-scale operations. The U.S. Army in 1861 consisted of only about 16,000 officers and men, many of whom were scattered in the West or resigned to join the Confederacy. Both governments would rely heavily on volunteer forces, citizen soldiers who brought patriotism but little training. Officers were often elected by their men or appointed for political reasons. Drills were chaotic. Supplies were uneven. Rifles were scarce, and some units marched off to war with hunting muskets, old flintlocks, or no arms at all. Yet for all this amateurism, the armies grew with breathtaking speed. By the summer of 1861, the Union had mobilized over 180,000 men. The Confederacy boasted nearly as many. These forces massed along the uncertain borders, Virginia and Maryland, Kentucky and Missouri, where geography and allegiance blurred. Both sides eyed each other across rivers and rail lines, waiting for the first great battle to define the war's course. That battle would come in Virginia, in the rolling countryside near a sleepy stream called Bull Run. In Washington, pressure mounted on Lincoln to act. Politicians, editors, and an impatient public demanded an immediate offensive to crush the rebellion. On to Richmond became the rallying cry. Confederate forces under General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, already a Southern hero for Fort Sumter, had gathered near Manassas Junction, about 30 miles southwest of the capital. Lincoln ordered General Irvin McDowell to march his Green Union Army and drive them back. McDowell knew his men were not ready. "They are green," he said, "and you cannot expect much from them." But the demand for action was irresistible. And so, in July 1861, the first Grand Union Army set out from Washington, accompanied by senators, journalists, and curious civilians who packed lunches and brought opera glasses to witness what they expected to be a quick and glorious affair. What they witnessed instead was chaos. On July 21st, McDowell's 35,000 men collided with Beauregard's 22,000 Confederates near Bull Run. The Union plan was to flank the enemy from the left while pressing from the front. At first, the strategy seemed to work. Union troops pushed back Confederate lines, and panic spread among the Southern ranks. But as the sun climbed higher, Confederate reinforcements arrived under General Joseph E. Johnston, who had marched swiftly from the Shenandoah Valley. Among them was a brigade led by a little-known Virginian named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. It was here, amid the fire and smoke of battle, that Jackson earned the name that would echo through history. As Confederate lines wavered, he stood firm, his troops resisting every advance. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," one officer cried, and the legend of Stonewall was born. The Union attack faltered. Confusion spread. Units lost contact. Officers gave conflicting orders. As the Confederate counterattack surged, Union soldiers broke ranks and fled. The retreat became a rout. Civilians, caught in the stampede, fled in terror. Wagons overturned. Horses panicked. A proud army disintegrated into a stampede back to Washington. Bull Run, known to Southerners as the Battle of Manassas, was a sobering moment. The Confederacy claimed victory, and Southern newspapers exulted. The Union tasted defeat and humiliation. But perhaps most importantly, both sides began to understand that this would not be a short war. The romance was gone. The war had teeth. In the aftermath of Bull Run, Lincoln moved swiftly to reorganize. He summoned General George B. McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac. McClellan, a brilliant organizer and West Point graduate, quickly whipped the demoralized army into shape. He drilled them, outfitted them, and inspired them. To his men, he was Little Mac, a beloved figure who restored their pride. But to Lincoln, he would soon become a source of frustration, a general whose caution bordered on paralysis. The Confederate leadership also took lessons from the battle. They knew now that the Union would not collapse after a single defeat. Jefferson Davis pushed for greater mobilization, and the Confederate Congress authorized the enlistment of 400,000 men. But the South faced critical shortages, from arms to uniforms to railcars. The blockade Lincoln had imposed on Southern ports was tightening, strangling the cotton economy and limiting imports. Already, the seeds of long-term struggle were visible. While the Eastern armies regrouped, attention turned to the West, a vast theater stretching from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River. Control of the rivers, especially the Mississippi and its tributaries, would be vital. The Union sought to split the Confederacy and deny it access to the resource-rich Trans-Mississippi region. And here, new figures emerged, rising stars who would shape the war's future. In Missouri, a bitter struggle raged between Unionists and Secessionists. Guerrilla warfare, brutal and personal, tore communities apart. The state remained officially loyal to the Union, but its loyalty was stained with blood. In Kentucky, Lincoln's home state, neutrality gave way to open conflict. The border states, so critical to Union strategy, were battlegrounds of hearts and minds as well as bullets. It was in Illinois that a quiet, unassuming general began to make his mark. Ulysses S. Grant, a former captain who had struggled in civilian life, was given command of Union forces in Cairo. He would soon launch a bold offensive into Tennessee, striking at Forts Henry and Donelson and shattering Confederate defenses in the Western Theater. But that drama lay ahead. For now, as autumn 1861 deepened, the war entered a strange and tense lull. Both sides continued to mobilize. The Confederate government struggled to centralize authority and build infrastructure. The Union ramped up production, passed the first income tax, and debated the purpose of the war. Was it merely to preserve the Union, or also to end slavery? Lincoln, ever cautious, treaded carefully, knowing the border states must be kept. But something was changing. The war had begun with flags and parades. Now it had blood on its hands. Families received their first letters from the front with trembling fingers. Towns erected their first monuments to the dead. Photographs of the Bull Run battlefield, littered with corpses, circulated in newspapers and galleries. The faces of the fallen, once names in a roster, now stared back with open eyes and silent mouths. The men who had marched off in April had changed. Their uniforms were dirtier, their eyes more sunken, their letters more somber. They had seen the elephant, as soldiers would come to say. They had heard the scream of shell and the rattle of musketry. They had seen friends fall, not in heroic charges, but in screaming agony. The war had begun, and it would not be over by Christmas. It would be years before peace returned. Years before the Union would be preserved or the Confederacy destroyed. Years before freedom would be redefined in blood and law. But in the fields of Virginia and the valleys of Kentucky, in the muddy camps and crowded hospitals, in the hearts of soldiers and citizens alike, a new reality took hold. This war would be long. It would be brutal. And it would remake the nation. Part 4. War in the West, Rivers, Railroads, and Rising Stars. In the smoke-shadowed wake of Bull Run, where the dreams of quick victory had crumbled in dust and panic, the war's spotlight began to shift westward. For while the Eastern armies licked their wounds and new generals sharpened their ambitions around Washington and Richmond, it was the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the sinews of a continent, that emerged as the true battleground of strategic consequence. Whoever held the rivers would carve apart the land. Whoever mastered the rail lines would control the movement of armies, men, and hope. And it was in this theater, far from the grand capitals and pressmen's eyes, that the Union would begin to find both its military footing and its most unexpected champions. The geography of the Western Theater was vast, cruel, and defining. From the Appalachian Mountains to the waters of the Mississippi, from the green hills of Kentucky to the muddy plains of Arkansas, the region sprawled across strategic choke points and complex loyalties. It was a place of divided states, where Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee each harbored within them a war of their own. More than mere frontiers, they were borderlands of identity, caught between two nations, two economies, and two visions of liberty. Here, the Civil War was not only army against army. It was neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and often, guerrilla against civilian. Missouri descended early into a maelstrom of chaos. Though it remained in the Union, pro-Confederate militias and state officials challenged federal authority with brutal resolve. The state's pro-secession governor, Claiborne Jackson, aligned with Confederate interests, while Unionist leaders such as Congressman Francis Preston Blair Jr. and the ruthless German-born General Nathaniel Lyon sought to keep Missouri tethered to the North. Lyon's seizure of the state capital and his swift military actions made him a hero to Unionists, but also escalated tensions. His death at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861 cemented the war's fierce reality and left Missouri a bleeding, contested land for years to come. It would host not great battles of fame, but countless skirmishes and atrocities, executions, raids, burnings that blurred the line between war and lawlessness. Kentucky, the birthplace of Lincoln himself, had tried to remain neutral. It would not be allowed to. The state's strategic position, its rivers, its railways, its access to the heart of the Confederacy, was simply too valuable. The Confederates moved first, occupying Columbus, Kentucky, on the Mississippi River. The Union quickly responded by seizing Paducah. With its neutrality shattered, Kentucky's legislature declared for the Union, and the state became a battleground. Its people split, its terrain exploited. Kentucky became what Lincoln once called the key to the whole conflict. "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game," he said, and he meant it. The fate of the West would hinge on what happened next in this wedge of contested soil. And so the focus fell, inevitably, on the rivers. The Mississippi River was the spine of the continent. From Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, it threaded the interior like a great artery, linking farms to markets, states to one another, and the divided halves of the war. Controlling the Mississippi and its major tributaries, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Ohio, meant splitting the Confederacy in two. It meant choking off supplies from Texas and Arkansas, isolating rebel forces west of the river, and delivering to the Union a path of iron and water deep into the southern heartland. But the river was not merely a goal. It was a battlefield. It was here that the Union would find, in the most unassuming of men, its most effective instrument of conquest. Ulysses S. Grant had once seemed a failure. He had resigned from the army under a cloud of suspicion. He had struggled in business, drifted between jobs, and barely provided for his family. But the war had called him back to service, and in the backwaters of Illinois, he had found purpose. Grant did not possess the theatrical flair of McClellan or the aristocratic polish of Lee. He did not write poetic dispatches or cultivate a hero's mystique. He simply acted, calmly, relentlessly, and with a clarity of will that would come to define the Union's path to victory. In early 1862, Grant launched a twin offensive to seize Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. These two Confederate strongholds guarded the heart of Tennessee, controlling vital access to the South's interior. Working in concert with Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote and his gunboat flotilla, Grant moved with stunning speed. Fort Henry fell quickly under naval bombardment. Donelson would prove harder. There, entrenched Confederate forces under generals including Gideon Pillow, John B. Floyd, and Simon Bolivar Buckner awaited the Union advance. For 3 days, fighting raged in the snow and freezing cold. The Confederates launched a desperate breakout attempt, nearly overwhelming Grant's right flank. But their momentum faltered, their leadership wavered, and Grant, refusing to retreat, tightened the noose. When Buckner sent a message requesting terms, he expected magnanimity. Instead, Grant replied with the words that would enter legend. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. The phrase, unconditional surrender grant, swept across the North. Fort Donelson fell. Over 12,000 Confederate soldiers were taken prisoner. The Union had its first major victory of the war, and Grant, once a forgotten officer, was now a rising star. The impact was seismic. With Donelson gone, the Confederates were forced to abandon all of western and central Tennessee. Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall, was seized by Union troops. The South's defensive line in the West collapsed like a row of dominoes. And more than that, the psychological tide shifted. Suddenly, the Union had momentum. Grant had shown that the Confederacy could be beaten, and beaten badly, on its own ground. But the price of progress would soon be paid in blood. Flush with success, Grant advanced southward along the Tennessee River, aiming to strike deeper into Mississippi. He camped his forces near a little-known church called Shiloh, place of peace in Hebrew. It would become anything but. On April 6, 1862, Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's unprepared army at dawn. The assault was ferocious. Union soldiers, many still eating breakfast or emerging from their tents, were driven back in confusion. Regiments collapsed, generals fell, and the Union line buckled under the fury of the Southern onslaught. But Grant did not break. Rallying his men along the banks of the river, he held through the night. Reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell arrived, and the next day, it was the Union's turn to counterattack. The fields that had run red now turned gray with retreating Confederates. The Battle of Shiloh ended in a brutal Union victory. It was the costliest battle in American history up to that point. Over 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. The scale of carnage shocked the nation. The romanticism that had still clung to the war, even after Bull Run, was now stripped away by the stench of corpses and the screams of the maimed. I saw men with their legs shot off, wrote one soldier, lying like logs in the underbrush, asking for water and praying for death. Peace, once imagined as a short march or a gallant duel, now receded into a fog of industrial slaughter. But Shiloh was not just a battle. It was a signal. It showed the terrible price the Union was willing to pay to drive southward, and the limits of Confederate defense in the face of coordinated land and river campaigns. General Johnston, the South's most senior field commander, was mortally wounded during the fighting. His death was a blow that would be felt for the rest of the war. As Grant consolidated his gains, other campaigns unfolded across the Western theater. Union forces captured Memphis. Naval squadrons under the command of David Farragut sailed up the Mississippi and bombarded New Orleans into submission, the South's largest city and a vital port. The fall of New Orleans in April 1862 dealt a severe blow to Confederate morale and cut off one of its major lifelines to the outside world. Railroads, too, came to dominate the war in the West. The Union's superior industrial base allowed for rapid repair and expansion of captured rail lines. Troops, cannon, and supplies now moved with unprecedented speed. In Tennessee and Mississippi, entire rail junctions became military objectives. Battles were fought not just to destroy armies, but to seize train yards, bridges, and tunnels. The war was increasingly a matter of logistics, a struggle of movement, production, and coordination. And here, slowly but surely, the Union began to excel. Yet the Confederacy did not crumble. Despite its losses, it remained defiant. General Braxton Bragg launched a counteroffensive, striking north into Kentucky in what would become the Battle of Perryville. Though tactically inconclusive, the campaign failed to rally Kentuckians to the Southern cause and forced Bragg to withdraw. In the East, Robert E. By the end of 1862, the Western theater had begun to define itself by different rhythms than the East. It was less about grand charges and more about strategy, less about reputation and more about results. Here, Union commanders, Grant chief among them, operated with greater autonomy, pursued aggressive maneuvers, and gradually tightened their grip. The rivers were now highways of blue coats and gunboats. The rail lines sang with the movement of Northern power. And above all, the idea took hold, unspoken but increasingly real, that the road to victory did not run only through Richmond. It might, in the end, run through Vicksburg. The war in the West had begun not with fanfare, but with resolve. It had waded through the icy waters of the Tennessee, through the thunder at Donelson, through the hell of Shiloh, and the conquest of New Orleans. It had introduced new names into the nation's vocabulary, Grant, Sherman, Farragut, and foreshadowed new kinds of war, total, industrial, relentless. As the Union turned its gaze toward Vicksburg and Chattanooga, as Confederate leaders scrambled to patch the fraying seams of their Western defenses, it became clear that the war was evolving. It was no longer merely a war to restore the old Union or to defend the Southern cause. It was becoming a war of endurance, of strategy, of ideas. And it would be won or lost not only on the fields of Virginia, but in the muddy, bloodied heart of the West. Part 5. The Struggle for the Heartland, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, and the Turning Tide. The year was 1863, and in the West, the rivers ran full with spring rain and the blood of the fallen. Already the Mississippi had begun to resemble less a boundary and more a battlefield. Its muddy waters choked with transport barges, ironclads, and the corpses of men who had gambled their lives for the fate of a continent. While Eastern eyes remained fixated on the seesawing clash between Lee and Hooker, between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, it was in the West that the war's pulse beat hardest. For here, the true test of Union resolve was about to unfold, not in a grand assault on a capital, but in a siege, a campaign, and a series of desperate gambits that would determine whether the Confederacy would remain whole or be broken in two. At the center of this unfolding drama loomed a name that would soon become synonymous with Southern resistance and Northern obsession, Vicksburg. Perched high on the bluffs of the Mississippi River, the city was less a metropolis than a fortress, its batteries commanding the river below, its hills bristling with earthworks, and its defenders well aware of their strategic worth. Vicksburg was the linchpin, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. As long as it held, the Confederacy could move men and material across the western states of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Should it fall, the South would be split in two, its western lifeline severed, and its ability to sustain a long war fatally compromised. President Lincoln understood this with crystalline clarity. Vicksburg is the key, he declared. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. For Ulysses S. Grant, now commanding the Army of the Tennessee, the task of capturing the city would become an obsession, a test of nerve, innovation, and endurance. In the spring of 1863, he began what would become one of the most audacious and complex campaigns of the entire war. The problem was geography. Vicksburg sat on high ground, its rear protected by a swampy wilderness of bayous, canebrakes, and tangled forest, while the river to its front presented a gauntlet of Confederate guns. Grant's early attempts to approach from the north or move ships past the batteries failed with brutal consequences. His army became mired in the Delta's flooded lowlands. Disease took hold, and Washington grew restless. Many questioned Grant's competence, but Grant was not a general easily turned aside. He experimented with canal-digging schemes, with diversions and feints, until at last he struck upon a daring plan. March his army southward along the west bank of the Mississippi, use Admiral David Porter's fleet to run the Vicksburg batteries at night, and then ferry his men across below the city for a campaign against its rear. It was a maneuver few thought possible, but Grant made it so. In April 1863, under cover of darkness, Porter's ironclads braved the Vicksburg guns, and though damaged, they passed. Grant's army slipped south, cut loose from its supply lines, living off the land, and crossed the river at Bruinsburg, below the city. From there, he struck inland, fast, decisive, and always one step ahead of Confederate defenders. In a whirlwind 3 weeks, Grant won a string of victories: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River Bridge. He cut off Vicksburg from reinforcements, turned east to defeat General John C. Pemberton's forces in the field, and then wheeled west to trap them inside the city. By May 18th, Vicksburg was under siege. The campaign had already demonstrated the depth of Grant's transformation as a commander. No longer simply the blunt instrument of Donelson or Shiloh, Grant had shown a mastery of maneuver warfare, using deception, speed, and aggression to outflank his foes. But the siege of Vicksburg would require a different kind of strength, patience, persistence, and a tolerance for suffering on both sides of the line. For 47 days, Grant's forces tightened their grip on the city. The Union Army encircled Vicksburg with trenches and redoubts, cutting off all escape. The Mississippi, now fully in Northern hands both above and below the city, denied resupply. The Confederate defenders, some 30,000 strong, dug deep into the hills and endured a slow descent into desperation. Civilians took shelter in caves carved from the clay bluffs. Horses and mules were slaughtered for food. Shells rained day and night, turning the once proud city into a ghostly labyrinth of shattered buildings and silence. Inside Vicksburg, morale collapsed. Outside, Grant maintained pressure but refused reckless assaults after early repulses. He had learned the cost of frontal attack and knew that starvation and exhaustion would do what cannon could not. Finally, on July 4, 1863, Independence Day, General Pemberton surrendered. Some 30,000 Confederates laid down their arms. The Union had secured the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was split. The strategic objective that had haunted Lincoln's dreams for 2 years had been achieved. The psychological impact was immense. In the North, celebrations erupted. In the South, despair took root. Worse yet for Confederate hopes, the surrender came just 1 day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg in the East. Together, the twin Union victories of July 1863 marked a turning point not merely in military terms, but in national will. Though the war would grind on for nearly 2 more years, the arc of momentum had shifted. The South's window for foreign recognition was closed. The North's appetite for total victory grew. Yet even as Vicksburg fell, another struggle unfolded to the east, one that would show just how desperate and defiant the Confederacy could remain. In Tennessee, Confederate General Braxton Bragg still held a major army and had fallen back to the key rail junction of Chattanooga after the Battle of Perryville. Chattanooga, like Vicksburg, held strategic weight far beyond its size. It controlled rail access through the Appalachian Mountains, linking the Deep South to Virginia. Losing it would expose Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas to Union invasion. Lincoln and his generals understood the stakes, and in late summer 1863, Major General William Rosecrans, commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, launched a bold campaign to outflank Bragg. With clever maneuvering and feints, Rosecrans compelled Bragg to abandon Chattanooga without a fight. It was a triumph of maneuver, but it would not remain one for long. Infuriated, Bragg received reinforcements from Mississippi and Virginia, including divisions under James Longstreet fresh from Gettysburg. He chose to strike back before Rosecrans could consolidate his position. On the banks of a winding stream called Chickamauga Creek, the two armies clashed in the bloodiest battle in the Western theater. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought on September 19th to 20th, 1863, was a chaotic, savage encounter waged in dense woods, rolling hills, and tangled ravines. Communication broke down almost immediately. Units blundered into one another in the fog and trees. Whole brigades fought isolated and unaware of the battle's larger shape. Bragg's Confederates struck hard but could not break the Union line until a fateful error opened a hole in the Federal position. Rosecrans, misreading a message, ordered a division to shift out of line, creating a gap at precisely the moment Longstreet's forces struck. The result was catastrophe. Confederate troops poured through the breach, shattering the Union right. Rosecrans fled in disarray back to Chattanooga, believing all was lost. But not all was lost. On the Union left, a stubborn stand was taking shape, one that would burn a new name into the annals of the war. Major General George H. Thomas, commanding a battered corps, rallied broken units and established a defensive line on a ridge known as Snodgrass Hill. Under relentless Confederate assault, Thomas held firm for hours, buying time for the Union Army to retreat in order. His stand saved the army from destruction. His courage earned him a new title, the Rock of Chickamauga. Despite their victory, the Confederates failed to follow up. Bragg besieged Chattanooga, hoping to starve out the Union forces, but missed his opportunity to destroy them. The Union, recognizing the crisis, acted swiftly. Grant was placed in overall command of Western operations. Reinforcements under Joseph Hooker and William Tecumseh Sherman arrived via rail in an unprecedented logistical feat. The Cracker Line was opened to supply the city, breaking the siege. Then, in late November 1863, Grant struck back. In a three-day campaign that would become legendary, Union forces broke the Confederate grip on Chattanooga. Hooker stormed Lookout Mountain in a mist-shrouded clash later dubbed the Battle Above the Clouds. Sherman attacked Missionary Ridge from the north. But it was Thomas again who delivered the final blow. Ordered to make a limited demonstration against the center, his men instead surged up Missionary Ridge in a spontaneous, near-miraculous charge, driving Bragg's army from the heights and securing the Union victory. Part 6. Sherman's Rise and the Scorched Earth, from Chattanooga to Atlanta. The winds that swept through Tennessee in the final days of 1863 carried the scent of something unmistakably new, a change in momentum, in command, in vision. The Union Army, no longer flailing in missteps or waiting for fate to favor it, was gathering force like a storm. At its helm, rising with the urgency of the hour and the confidence of hard-won experience, stood a general whose name would come to be spoken with admiration, fear, and hatred in equal measure. William Tecumseh Sherman had long existed in the shadow of others, Grant, Halleck, McClellan, but now he would blaze a path all his own. From the hills of Chattanooga to the gates of Atlanta, Sherman would become the architect of a new kind of war, relentless, unromantic, and total. The victory at Chattanooga had opened the door, but it was not enough merely to crack the Confederacy's outer shell. The Union needed to drive deep to carve out its heart. And that heart, both logistically and symbolically, beat in Atlanta. A transportation hub, a munitions center, and a beacon of Southern resistance, Atlanta represented the connective tissue of the Confederacy's eastern half. If Vicksburg had severed the Confederacy laterally, then the fall of Atlanta would split it longitudinally and gut its ability to coordinate, resupply, or resist with unity. To reach Atlanta, Sherman would first have to march through a land fiercely defended and choked with mountain passes, rivers, and redoubts. But he would not march alone. By the spring of 1864, Sherman had been placed in command of the Military Division of the Mississippi, overseeing all Union operations in the West. His closest friend and wartime partner, Ulysses S. Grant, had been elevated to General-in-Chief and moved east to take personal control of the campaign against Robert E. Lee. Together, Grant and Sherman devised a strategy as brutal as it was brilliant, two massive, coordinated thrusts. While Grant would hammer Lee in Virginia and pin the Confederate Army near Richmond, Sherman would strike through Georgia and tear the southern interior apart. "I will make Georgia howl," Sherman promised. And he would. Opposing him stood General Joseph E. Johnston, a cautious and calculating Confederate officer whom President Jefferson Davis distrusted but could not yet replace. Johnston's army, dug in along the rugged terrain between Chattanooga and Atlanta, outnumbered and outgunned, nevertheless held a major advantage in defense. His strategy was Fabian: delay, harass, entrench, and withdraw only when necessary. Sherman's would be far more aggressive: maneuver, flank, strike, and if all else failed, grind the enemy down. On May 7, 1864, Sherman's armies began their advance into Georgia. Nearly 100,000 strong, they comprised three wings: the Army of the Cumberland under George H. Thomas, the Army of the Tennessee under James B. McPherson, and the Army of the Ohio under John Schofield. Opposing them, Johnston fielded roughly 60,000 Confederates. But every inch of ground would cost dearly. The opening weeks of the campaign unfolded like a deadly waltz. Sherman would attempt to flank Johnston's entrenched positions, first at Rocky Face Ridge, then at Resaca, and Johnston would retreat just in time to avoid being enveloped. Again and again, Sherman probed, threatened his enemy's rear, and forced withdrawals, but was denied a decisive victory. It was a campaign of chess, not checkers, of moves and countermoves, of railroad destruction and bridge building, of heat, mud, and unending skirmishes. All the while, his armies moved ever closer to Atlanta. By mid-June, the contest reached a climax at Kennesaw Mountain, where Johnston, backed into stronger terrain, refused to retreat. Frustrated by weeks of maneuvering and goaded by critics, Sherman ordered a rare frontal assault. It was a costly error. On June 27th, Union troops hurled themselves against fortified Confederate lines and were repulsed with over 2,000 casualties in a single morning. It was a sobering lesson, and Sherman never repeated it. "I regard it as a mistake," he admitted. "I do not propose to renew the assault." Despite the setback, the momentum was undeniable. Slowly, inexorably, Johnston was pushed closer to Atlanta. But back in Richmond, Jefferson Davis's patience with his general was wearing thin. Johnston's constant retreats, however tactically sound, looked to many in the Confederate capital like cowardice. Davis wanted aggression. He wanted a commander who would fight, not fade. On July 17th, he removed Johnston and replaced him with General John Bell Hood, a brave, impetuous officer who had lost an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, and who now inherited an army on the defensive with Atlanta at its back. Hood's arrival changed everything. Within days, he launched a series of brutal counterattacks at Peachtree Creek, at Atlanta itself on July 22nd, and again at Ezra Church. Each time, his soldiers fought with desperate valor, and each time they were repulsed with staggering losses. The Battle of Atlanta, one of the bloodiest of the campaign, cost Hood over 8,000 men, and still Sherman closed in. By late August, the siege of Atlanta had begun. Sherman encircled the city and cut its rail lines, launching flanking movements that threatened to trap Hood's army. Realizing the city could no longer be held, Hood evacuated on the night of September 1st. The next day, Union troops entered Atlanta. Fires raged. The city that had once been a hub of Confederate industry and confidence now lay in ruins. The fall of Atlanta sent shockwaves across the nation. In the North, it electrified public opinion. President Lincoln, locked in a bitter re-election battle with George McClellan and facing mounting war weariness, suddenly saw his political fortunes reverse. Where once it had seemed the Union might vote for peace, now it leaned toward victory. The soldiers voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. The people followed. In November 1864, Lincoln was re-elected with a commanding majority, and the Union war effort gained renewed legitimacy and resolve. In the South, Atlanta's loss was a spiritual blow as much as a strategic one. The Confederacy's heart had been breached. No longer was the war confined to borderlands and sieges. Now Union soldiers walked Georgia's roads, drank from its wells, and slept in its homes. The very idea of Southern invincibility was crumbling. But Sherman was not done. With Atlanta secured, he turned to an even more audacious vision, one that would make his name infamous in Dixie. He would march to the sea. The idea was radical. Instead of returning north or chasing Hood's battered army west, Sherman proposed to strike out across Georgia to the port of Savannah, without supply lines, living off the land, destroying railroads, factories, and food sources, and sowing chaos deep in the Confederacy's interior. It was not merely a campaign. It was psychological warfare. His goal was to make war so terrible, so undeniable, that Southern civilians would feel its cost and press their leaders to end it. In mid-November, Sherman left Atlanta in flames. Literally. His engineers had destroyed military facilities, rail yards, and manufacturing plants, and in the ensuing fires, whole districts were consumed. Then, with 62,000 men divided into two wings, Sherman set off through Georgia like a biblical scourge. The march to the sea was unlike any campaign seen in American history. Sherman's troops moved swiftly, cutting a swath 60 miles wide. They foraged aggressively, confiscated livestock, and burned what they could not use. Railroads were torn up and twisted into Sherman's neckties. Iron rails wrapped around trees and left to cool. Plantation houses were looted. Cotton gins destroyed. Though violence against civilians was not officially sanctioned, lawlessness sometimes prevailed. For Southern families along the route, the march brought ruin, fear, and disillusionment. But it was war, and it was working. Resistance was minimal. Confederate forces were scattered and overwhelmed. By the time Sherman reached Savannah in December 1864, the city's defenders surrendered without a fight. On December 22nd, Sherman sent Lincoln a telegram. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton." It was a moment of triumph, but it also foreshadowed the war's final, grimmest stage. The war in the West had changed. It was no longer about winning battles. It was about breaking will, about denying the enemy not just ground, but hope. Sherman had become the embodiment of this doctrine. His vision of hard war, war that targeted the infrastructure, the economy, and the spirit of the enemy, would not end in Georgia. It would continue into the Carolinas and beyond. And yet, Sherman's campaign was not just destruction. It was also a liberation. Tens of thousands of enslaved men and women followed his columns, seeing in the Union Army their chance for freedom. Some joined as laborers, others as guides. Many simply walked behind the blue lines, barefoot and hungry, toward a future uncertain but unchained. Sherman, pragmatic above all, saw them as both burden and promise. His army carved a corridor not only of ruin but of emancipation. With every mile, slavery shrank. As the year 1864 came to a close, the Union had not only turned the tide, it had begun to sweep everything before it. The Confederacy was bleeding from 100 cuts. Lee was pinned by Grant in Virginia. Hood's army was reeling. And in Georgia, the very soil of rebellion had been torn apart, plowed under by marching columns. Sherman had changed the face of war. The old chivalry was gone, replaced by a relentless march toward victory at any cost. There was no going back. The war's final act was approaching, and the Union's final vengeance was only beginning. Part 7. Total War and the Collapse of Resistance. The Carolinas Campaign and the End of the Confederacy. The fires of Savannah still smoldered as the Union soldiers celebrated Christmas of 1864, their boots caked in Georgia clay, their bellies full from foraged spoils, and their minds fixed not on home but forward, northward, toward the Carolinas. There was little rest for William Tecumseh Sherman's army, for though the sea had been reached and the Confederate South split down the middle, the war had not yet ended. And Sherman, now a grim prophet of hard war, was not content to stop with Georgia's ruin. His march had shattered the enemy's railways, storehouses, and confidence, but it had not yet broken their will. To do that, he would have to march again, this time through the very cradle of secession. South Carolina, the first to secede, the spark of rebellion, the ground where Fort Sumter had thundered the opening salvos of this long and bloody war. Sherman had not forgotten. He believed the state that had lit the fire must now be made to feel the full heat of its own making. What had begun as strategy would now evolve into punishment. It was not vengeance for its own sake, but a reckoning. If war was the midwife of peace, then the birth would not be gentle. Sherman's soldiers, hardened by months of foraging, raiding, and battle, now stood as a force unlike any other in the war. They moved like shadows across the land, unshackled from supply lines, living off the terrain, moving with surgical precision and overwhelming strength. His two great wings, Slocum's Army of Georgia on the left, Howard's Army of the Tennessee on the right, numbered more than 60,000 men. Behind them lay scorched earth. Ahead stood the battered remnants of Confederate armies, stretched thin and demoralized. Even before they crossed the Savannah River into South Carolina in early February 1865, word of Sherman's next march sent panic into the Confederate heartland. Local militias scrambled. Slaveholders fled inland. And all across the Carolinas, railroad bridges were burned preemptively, supplies were hidden, and families clung to rumors and prayers. Some hoped the Yankees would be less harsh than legend claimed. Others braced for the worst. Sherman gave no official orders to burn or pillage, but he gave no orders to stop it either. From the moment his army crossed into South Carolina, the tone of the campaign darkened. Buildings were torched. Towns burned. Freed slaves flocked to the advancing columns, swelling the wake of the Union Army into a human tide of hope and desperation. For the enslaved, Sherman's arrival was not a curse, but a deliverance. But for the Southern aristocracy, the plantation owners and proud secessionists, it was an apocalypse. And in a war that had already blurred the lines between military and civilian, South Carolina became the crucible of destruction. Columbia, the state capital, would come to symbolize this fury. When Sherman's troops entered the city in mid-February, it was already in chaos. Confederate defenders had fled. Fires had already begun to spread, whether from retreating soldiers, freed prisoners, or drunken looters remains debated. But when dawn rose on February 18th, Columbia lay in ruins, nearly two-thirds of it consumed by flame. The air reeked of smoke and scorched cotton. Though Sherman denied ordering the fire, he did little to conceal his satisfaction. "They sowed the wind," he said, "and now they are reaping the whirlwind." From Columbia, the march turned north, slicing through the Carolina backcountry with grim purpose. Town after town surrendered or collapsed. Resistance was sporadic and ineffective. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, recalled to lead the last fragments of the Southern defense, could do little more than shadow Sherman's advance. His army, once formidable, had become a ghost, undermanned, underfed, and undermined by desertion and disease. Yet Sherman's campaign was not merely destruction. With every mile, the reality of emancipation was made tangible. The promise of Lincoln's proclamation, once a distant political decree, now walked on muddy boots and blue coats. Freedmen, many of whom had once been chained on the very plantations now smoldering, formed refugee columns behind the Union Army. Some worked as guides, others as porters or laborers. A few, armed and resolute, took up rifles and joined the march. The war, for them, had never been abstract. It was personal. It was deliverance. Meanwhile, further north, the war's final chords were being struck in Virginia, where Ulysses S. Grant, grim and relentless, kept the Army of Northern Virginia locked in a death grip around Petersburg. Since the summer of 1864, Grant had refused to give Robert E. Lee room to breathe. Every escape route was pressured. Every supply line threatened. Lee, with his ranks thinning and supplies dwindling, could not hold forever. And Grant, for all his tactical patience, sensed the end drawing near. Lincoln, too, had begun to see the light at the end of the long, dark tunnel. But his heart remained heavy. He had visited the war front at City Point, Virginia, walking among the men who bled for the Union. He had spoken to Grant and to Sherman. He had begun to imagine the reunion of the states not just as a political act, but a spiritual one. Yet even as victory approached, the road to peace remained unclear. What would be done with the South? With the millions of freedmen? With the leaders of rebellion? These questions loomed like thunderclouds beyond the battlefield. Back in North Carolina, Sherman's forces entered Fayetteville in March and moved east toward Goldsboro, aiming to link with additional Union troops under Schofield arriving from the coast. Johnston, desperate to strike a blow before Union forces fully consolidated, launched a final assault near Bentonville on March 19th. It was the last major Confederate offensive in the Carolinas, and it failed. Outnumbered and outflanked, Johnston withdrew after 3 days of bloody fighting. His army would never again take the initiative. By late March, the Union juggernaut had united. Sherman and Schofield joined forces. Grant tightened his noose around Lee. Sheridan slashed through the Shenandoah Valley. Every front moved in harmony. The Confederacy, once full of fire and pride, was now a house collapsing inward. On April 2nd, after a brutal 9-month siege, Grant broke through Petersburg. Lee, realizing Richmond could no longer be defended, informed Jefferson Davis that the capital must be abandoned. That night, the Confederate government fled. The next day, Union soldiers marched into Richmond, finding the city in flames, abandoned, and defeated. Lincoln, remarkably, would visit just days later, walking through the streets of the rebel capital without guard or ceremony, shaking the hands of freedmen who fell to their knees in awe. "Don't kneel to me," he told them. You must kneel only to God and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter. But even in these final moments, Lee did not surrender. He led his dwindling army west, hoping to reach food and reinforcements in Lynchburg. Grant pursued relentlessly, outmarching, outmaneuvering, and outflanking the Confederate columns at every turn. Cavalry blocked escape routes. Infantry pressed the rear. Finally, at Appomattox Courthouse, on April 9, 1865, Lee saw the end. Surrounded, starving, and bloodied, he asked for terms. The surrender of Lee to Grant remains one of the most poignant moments in American history. At the McLean House, Grant, mud-splattered and unassuming, offered generous terms. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms and horses. The men would be paroled and sent home. There would be no mass arrests, no chains. "The war is over," Grant said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Sherman, in North Carolina, would soon accept Johnston's surrender under similar terms. Though initially criticized for being too lenient, Sherman believed what Grant believed. Peace would come not from humiliation, but from reconciliation. The Union had been preserved. The rebellion had ended. There was no need for vengeance now, only healing. But healing would not come quickly. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln attended Ford's Theater in Washington. There, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor, crept into the presidential box and fired a bullet into Lincoln's head. The president died the next morning. The jubilation of victory turned instantly to mourning. Lincoln, who had guided the nation through its darkest night, who had spoken of malice toward none and charity for all, was gone. The weight of peace now fell on a broken country and a government suddenly adrift. Sherman wept when he heard the news. So did Grant. So did the men in blue and the freedmen in gray rags who had followed the march across Georgia and into Carolina. The war had ended, but the future was unclear. In the ashes of Columbia and Atlanta, in the shattered plantations of the Deep South, in the silence that followed Bentonville and Appomattox, a new nation stirred, uncertain, battered, but born anew. The Civil War had consumed more than 600,000 lives. It had torn families apart, upended an entire economic system, and redefined the meaning of freedom and nationhood. Sherman's march through the Carolinas was more than a military campaign. It was the final act of a struggle that had begun with cannons over Charleston Harbor and ended with fire, flight, and surrender. It embodied the transformation of the war, from a conflict to preserve the Union into a revolution to remake it. The Union had not just been saved, it had been reborn. And now, from the ruins of rebellion, the work of reconstruction would begin. Part 8. Rebirth and Reckoning, Reconstruction, Resistance, and the Struggle for Justice. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was not peace. It was a hush filled with questions, with ghosts, with smoke still drifting upward from the bones of shattered cities and the broken bodies of a fractured nation. The cannons had gone silent in April of 1865, but their echoes would resonate through the American soul for generations to come. Appomattox had closed the chapter of battle, but it opened another, murkier, messier, and, in some ways, just as dangerous. The country had been saved. Now it had to be rebuilt. But rebuilding was not just bricks and laws. It was identity. It was justice. It was the reckoning with freedom's meaning and whether a country born in slavery could truly remake itself without drowning in the very legacy it sought to overcome. Lincoln had not lived to see it. His assassination, just days after Robert E. Lee's surrender, was not only a tragedy, it was a turning point. The man who had guided the Union through 4 years of bloody trial, who had grown into the war's conscience, had been taken from the country at the very moment it needed his moral compass most. His successor, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessean Democrat with deep resentments and shallow vision, now stood at the helm of Reconstruction. A Southerner by birth, but a Unionist by politics, Johnson believed in reunification, but not in transformation. Where Lincoln had spoken of a new birth of freedom, Johnson offered only a restoration of the old. It began with proclamations and ended with betrayal. Johnson issued mass pardons to former Confederates, restored lands to rebel plantation owners, and offered a swift reentry to states that merely agreed to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in name but not necessarily in structure. Under Johnson's lenient policies, former Confederate leaders regained political power in state governments across the South. By late 1865, many states had elected men who had taken up arms against the Union, and some of the very architects of secession now sat in Congress once more. But worse than that was what emerged from their pens, the Black Codes. These laws, passed throughout the former Confederacy, sought to bind freedmen to a new form of bondage. Vagrancy laws made unemployment a crime punishable by forced labor. Apprenticeship statutes allowed courts to bind black children to white landowners without consent. Freedmen could not own firearms, testify against whites, or serve on juries. In many places, African Americans had more freedom during the Union occupation than after their states were restored. The North watched in outrage. Radical Republicans in Congress, who had long demanded harsher terms for the South and real civil rights for the freedmen, recoiled at Johnson's betrayal. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, once voices at the edge of the political spectrum, now found themselves leading a growing chorus demanding a different path. They called not just for abolition, but for equality, not just for the end of slavery, but the birth of citizenship. In 1866, the conflict between Congress and the President exploded. Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act, the first federal law to define citizenship and protect civil rights regardless of race. Congress overrode his veto, the first time in American history such a major bill was passed over a presidential objection. It was a declaration of war between the branches of government, and Reconstruction itself became the battlefield. The midterm elections of 1866 were a referendum. The people sided with Congress. Radicals gained overwhelming majorities, and by 1867, the Reconstruction Acts were passed. These laws divided the South into 5 military districts, each under Union command, with orders to oversee new governments based on universal male suffrage. Black men would vote, and white men who had taken up arms against the Union would not, unless Congress said otherwise. To rejoin the Union, states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all born in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. It was a revolution in law, but its enforcement would rest on men with muskets. Military Reconstruction brought change, but also resistance. In places like Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana, newly freed black men voted, organized, and even won office. The first black senators and congressmen in American history emerged during this period. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce among them. Across the South, freedmen's conventions met to demand education, labor rights, and fair treatment. Black communities built schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. The Freedmen's Bureau, under men like General Oliver O. Howard, provided food, legal aid, and schools to millions. For the first time in American history, freedom was being shaped not only by politicians in Washington, but by freedmen themselves. But these gains came under fire, literally. Former Confederates did not accept defeat quietly. Out of the ashes of rebellion rose a campaign of terror. In 1866, in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 ex-Confederate officers formed a secret society, the Ku Klux Klan. Dressed in white robes and hoods, claiming to be ghosts of Confederate dead, they began a reign of intimidation, targeting black voters, Republican politicians, teachers, and anyone who threatened the old order. Their tactics were horrific: night rides, whippings, arson, lynchings. And they were not alone. Across the South, other groups, white leagues, red shirts, rifle clubs, joined the crusade to restore white supremacy by violence. By the early 1870s, the federal government struck back. President Ulysses S. Grant, elected in 1868 on a wave of support from both freedmen and Union veterans, signed the Enforcement Acts, laws that made Klan violence a federal crime and empowered the military to crush the insurgency. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested. The Klan, as an organized body, was temporarily broken, but the will to resist equality had not disappeared. It merely changed shape. The South, like a wounded animal, began to claw back through more subtle means. As Reconstruction governments tried to build schools and roads, expand voting rights, and tax plantations to pay for public services, they found themselves undermined at every turn. Local sheriffs refused to enforce laws. White juries refused to convict racists. Northern support began to waver. The Panic of 1873 triggered an economic depression that shifted national attention from Reconstruction to recovery. The scandals of Grant's administration, though he personally remained untainted, eroded Republican credibility. By the mid-1870s, the will to fight for the freedmen's rights was weakening in the North, just as resistance was hardening in the South. State by state, Redeemers, white Southern Democrats, won back control through intimidation, fraud, and economic coercion. In Mississippi, the so-called Mississippi Plan used violence to suppress black voting and force political turnover. In South Carolina, armed white militias clashed with integrated Republican state governments. In Louisiana, 2 rival governments claimed legitimacy. Reconstruction was not ending through consensus, it was being overthrown. The final blow came in 1877. The presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden ended in deadlock, with disputed results in several Southern states. To resolve the crisis, a backroom deal was struck, the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president, but federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Within months, the last Republican governments collapsed, and the South entered a new era, not of reunion, but of redemption. Redemption, however, was a cruel misnomer. What followed was the rise of Jim Crow, an architecture of legal segregation, disenfranchisement, and racial violence that would last nearly a century. The dreams of Reconstruction, of an interracial democracy, of justice rooted in equality, were buried under a system of terror and exclusion. Schools were segregated. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Lynch mobs enforced racial boundaries with impunity. The federal government turned away. The North, tired of the South's resistance, chose peace over justice. And yet, the legacy of Reconstruction did not die. It lived in the black churches that became political sanctuaries, in the stories passed from generation to generation, in the very amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, 15th, that, though gutted in practice, remained like embers waiting to be rekindled. The promise of a multiracial democracy had not vanished, it had merely been deferred. Reconstruction remains one of the most misunderstood and maligned chapters in American history. To some, it was a failure, a noble experiment undone by racism and political cowardice. To others, it was a missed opportunity, a vision unfulfilled. But to those who lived it, especially the freedmen who claimed their dignity amidst danger, it was a time of hope, resistance, and bold dreaming. The war had ended. Slavery had been abolished. But the battle for freedom had only begun. Part 9, Legacies of Valor, Memory, Monuments, and the Myth of the Lost Cause. The guns had fallen silent, and the soldiers had laid down their arms. But the struggle over the Civil War's meaning had only just begun. In the physical realm, the Union had triumphed. The Confederacy was defeated, its armies disbanded, its cities burned, its president imprisoned. But victory in battle did not ensure victory in memory. As the years stretched beyond Appomattox, and the generations turned from those who fought the war to those who merely remembered it, a new kind of conflict emerged, one not fought with rifles and cannons, but with textbooks, monuments, ceremonies, and silence. It was a war over legacy, over interpretation, over who got to define what the Civil War was truly about. And in this second contest, the lines of battle were redrawn. North versus South, yes, but also truth versus nostalgia, justice versus myth, and the emancipated promise of freedom against the lingering shadow of white supremacy. The veterans returned home, those who could. For the North, many were greeted as heroes, parading down streets in uniforms faded but proud, banners flying beneath skies that had once echoed with cannon fire. Grand Army of the Republic posts were founded, a fraternal order for Union veterans, filled with tales of courage and sacrifice, of preserving the Union and striking the chains of bondage. Monuments sprang up in town squares and cemeteries across the North, granite sentinels etched with names and battles. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, where young men gave their lives for what President Lincoln had called the last best hope of earth. But for the South, the homecoming was different. It was haunted. It was hushed. Entire towns were scarred by the loss of a generation, with empty sleeves and missing limbs marking the survivors. Cities like Atlanta and Columbia still bore the blackened wounds of fire. Plantations lay in ruins, and the economic system that once depended on millions of enslaved lives had collapsed. But instead of reckoning with the cause of the war, secession to defend slavery, the South began constructing a different narrative, one rooted not in guilt or accountability, but in defiance and romanticism. This narrative would come to be known as the Lost Cause. It did not begin as a formal ideology. At first, it was a coping mechanism. Southern women, many of whom had suffered deeply during the war, formed ladies' memorial associations. They tended to graves, honored the Confederate dead, and organized decoration days, predecessors to Memorial Day. But mourning soon gave way to myth-making. These women began erecting monuments not merely to honor the fallen, but to assert a vision of the past in which the Confederacy had been noble, its leaders virtuous, and its cause, however defeated, just. This vision would be polished and promoted by Southern elites, former generals, and clergymen. Jubal Early, a former Confederate general, became one of its chief architects. He and others insisted that the war had not been about slavery, but about states' rights and Southern honor. Robert E. Lee was reimagined not as a traitor to his country, but as a reluctant warrior, a man of unmatched virtue who fought for his homeland. Jefferson Davis was portrayed as a martyr. The brutality of slavery was obscured or dismissed. The freedmen were pushed from view. In this new mythology, the Old South became a place of chivalry and gentility, where white men were gallant and their cause was pure. Monuments played a central role in cementing this alternate memory. By the turn of the 20th century, statues of Confederate generals began to rise, not just in cemeteries, but in prominent public spaces, courthouse lawns, town centers, Capitol grounds. Lee on horseback, towering over Richmond. Stonewall Jackson, silent and stern, looking west. These weren't mere memorials. They were political symbols, assertions of white Southern identity and a reassertion of dominance over the social order in a post-Reconstruction world. The placement and timing of these monuments was no accident. They peaked not during or immediately after the war, but decades later, during the height of Jim Crow. As African Americans fought for civil rights, education, and equality, Southern whites used the lost cause narrative to justify segregation and disenfranchisement. Confederate monuments were built alongside new laws that codified racial oppression, and together they sent a clear message. The South had lost the war, but it would control the memory of it. This battle over memory extended into the nation's classrooms. Textbooks written in the South downplayed slavery, romanticized plantation life, and framed the war as a tragic misunderstanding between brothers. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy lobbied aggressively to influence what children were taught. In many places, the term Civil War was avoided entirely in favor of war between the states or even war of Northern aggression. The North's victory on the battlefield began to erode under the relentless campaign to rewrite the war's moral narrative. Even in the North, resistance to the truth emerged. As the wounds of war healed and the nation sought reconciliation, many Northerners found it easier to forgive their former enemies than to continue fighting for black civil rights. Union veterans and Confederate veterans began to appear together at commemorative events, Gettysburg reunions, blue and gray encampments, celebrating their shared valor while politely ignoring the cause that had divided them. Brotherhood among white veterans was exalted, while the voices of black soldiers and freedmen were muted or ignored entirely. The price of this reconciliation was truth. In forging a new national unity, the country allowed the lost cause to seep into its veins. Films like The Birth of a Nation in 1915 portrayed the Klan as heroes and Reconstruction as a time of chaos and black misrule. Woodrow Wilson, a historian and then president, screened the film in the White House. The myths of the lost cause had become mainstream, deeply embedded in American culture, shaping the consciousness of generations. But not all accepted this whitewashed past. African American communities fought to preserve the truth, even as their voices were marginalized. Black scholars like W.B. Du Bois wrote powerful histories of black participation in the war and Reconstruction, highlighting the courage of black soldiers and the promise of freedom still denied. In places like South Carolina and Louisiana, black families told stories of their ancestors who fought for the Union, who voted for the first time, who stood against lynch mobs with nothing but their dignity and a memory of what freedom had once meant. Still, these stories often remained outside the national narrative. The triumph of the lost cause in public memory had real consequences, not just for understanding the past, but for shaping the future. It justified segregation, racial violence, and exclusion. It framed the Civil War as a war of equals, as if there were moral equivalency between the defense of slavery and the struggle for liberty. The Civil War, then, did not end in 1865. Its battles continued in the mind and the heart, in the stories told at dinner tables, in the plaques on courthouse walls, in the lessons taught in schoolrooms. It continued in the fight over who counted as American and whose suffering mattered. It continued in the civil rights movements of the 20th century, when marchers crossed bridges and faced police dogs under the same flags that once flew above Confederate armies. It continues still, in the debates over monuments and memory, over flags and forgotten truths. And yet, amid all this, the valor of those who truly fought for the future has endured. The black soldiers of the United States colored troops, the abolitionists who gave their lives for a cause greater than themselves, the freedmen who demanded equality and paid for it with their lives. They left a legacy deeper than stone. Though their stories were buried for decades beneath layers of myth and silence, they have never truly vanished. Today, the work of recovery continues. Historians have uncovered letters and diaries, pension records and photographs, voices long thought lost. Communities have begun to challenge old monuments and lift up new ones that tell the fuller story, the harder truth. Museums and memorials now reckon with the complexity of the past, not to shame the nation, but to help it grow. The Civil War was more than a conflict between states. It was a confrontation between visions of America, one rooted in bondage and hierarchy, the other in liberty and equality. That struggle did not end with surrender or even with Reconstruction. It echoes still, in ways both subtle and profound. And how we remember it, truthfully, fully, courageously, will shape what kind of country America continues to become. The valor remembered should not only be that of those who charged into battle beneath flags of glory, but also of those who bore invisible wounds, who carried the burden of a denied history, who believed in a country not yet born. The real legacy of the Civil War lies not in marble generals on high pedestals, but in the quiet resistance of truth against the tide of forgetting. History is not just what happened. It is what we choose to remember and how we choose to honor it. Part 10, A New Birth of Freedom, the Civil War's Enduring Legacy in Modern America. When the cannons cooled and the fields emptied of men and the blood-soaked soil of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Vicksburg began to settle back into silence, America was left not only with the rubble of a great war, but with the weight of its meaning. And as the years stretched on, it became increasingly clear that while the Union had been preserved, the soul of that Union would remain contested, fragile, and unfinished. The Civil War did not so much conclude as it transformed, passing from musket volleys into courtrooms, legislatures, school books, films, marches, monuments, and memories. In every age since, the ghost of that war has lingered, shaping debates, fueling movements, shadowing elections, and echoing through the American conscience. In the century and a half that followed Appomattox, the Civil War's legacy has proved as enduring as it is elusive. The promise of a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln envisioned at Gettysburg, has remained both a lodestar and a challenge, a goal proclaimed but never fully reached. That phrase, so simple, so potent, has threaded its way through every great national reckoning, serving as both an indictment of how far the country has fallen short and as a rallying cry for those determined to bend the arc of history toward justice. At the heart of this enduring legacy lies the question of race. Though the war had decisively ended the institution of slavery, it had not eliminated the structures of white supremacy that undergirded it. Reconstruction was a brief, shining moment of possibility, during which African Americans voted, held office, built schools, and claimed the public square. But that promise was violently rolled back, replaced by a century of Jim Crow laws, lynching, disenfranchisement, and enforced silence. The Union had won the war, but the peace was surrendered to a white South determined to retain social control. And yet, Black Americans did not stop fighting. In every generation since, they have invoked the Civil War's legacy as proof of their stake in the American project. The descendants of the enslaved who had been denied personhood in 1860 could now point to their ancestors who had fought in the United States colored troops, who had followed Sherman, who had marched beside Lincoln, who had risked everything for a Union they believed could be just. They had not been passive recipients of freedom, but active agents in its creation. The Civil War, properly remembered, was not merely a war between white men over the fate of the South, but a revolution in which African Americans played a central, indispensable role. This truth, however, long lay buried beneath layers of myth. The 20th century witnessed a cultural reckoning that unfolded slowly, unevenly, and often bitterly. In 1963, as Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he invoked the promise made 50 years ago, a deliberate echo of the Gettysburg Address. The Emancipation Proclamation, he said, had been a beacon of hope, but its promise remained unfulfilled. The Civil Rights Movement, in many ways, was a continuation of the Civil War, a second Reconstruction waged not with bullets and bayonets, but with sit-ins and marches, with court cases and conscience. As protesters were beaten in Selma and buses were bombed in Montgomery, as schoolchildren faced mobs in Little Rock and churches were bombed in Birmingham, the legacy of the Civil War surged to the forefront of American life once more. Flags that had flown over Confederate armies now flew over state capitals and segregationist rallies. Statues erected decades after the war now stood as silent sentinels to a vision of the South that was at odds with the nation's proclaimed ideals. And yet, the movement endured. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, these were legislative milestones built atop the moral foundation laid by the Civil War. They were not the end of the journey, but the continuation of a struggle that had begun on the battlefields of Manassas and Memphis. But even as the country made halting progress toward equality, resistance to that progress found powerful expression. The myth of the lost cause persisted, resilient and adaptable. It found new life in textbooks, in Hollywood, in Southern pride movements, and in political rhetoric. It was a comforting story for many, a way to remember ancestors without confronting their cause, a way to celebrate valor while obscuring injustice. The Confederate flag, once a battlefield banner, became a symbol not just of Southern heritage, as its defenders claimed, but also of defiance against federal power and civil rights. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, America's relationship to its Civil War past came under renewed scrutiny. Historians challenged long-held myths, recovering forgotten voices, and insisting on complexity over simplicity, truth over sentiment. Museums and documentaries sought to present a fuller picture, one that included the enslaved, the free black communities, the Native Americans drawn into the war's periphery, the women who sustained homes and hospitals, the immigrants who fought for a nation still deciding what it meant to be American. Public memory, however, lagged behind. Battles raged over Confederate monuments. Were they heritage or hate? In cities like New Orleans, Richmond, and Charlottesville, debates erupted over statues of Lee, Davis, and Jackson. In Charlottesville in 2017, a rally to defend a Confederate monument descended into deadly violence, laying bare the enduring potency of the Civil War's symbols and the dangers of leaving its myths unchallenged. The nation was reminded that the war's embers still smoldered, that history denied or distorted could become weaponized in the present. And yet, a reckoning was underway. Across the country, Americans began re-examining not only what they remembered, but how they remembered. Some statues came down, while others were contextualized. New memorials were erected, like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which honors victims of lynching and connects slavery to modern-day racial injustice. Civil War battlefields added plaques and exhibits explaining not just troop movements, but also the causes and consequences of the conflict. Education began to shift as well. New curricula aimed to teach the Civil War as it was, not a clash of brother against brother in tragic misunderstanding, but a violent reckoning over slavery, secession, and the meaning of freedom. Students learned about the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision, the courage of the 54th Massachusetts, the horrors of Andersonville, and the triumph of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They read not only the words of Lincoln and Lee, but also of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and Sojourner Truth. The digital age brought new tools to this reckoning. Online archives allowed access to letters, photographs, pension records, and service files once confined to dusty shelves. Descendants traced their family trees and discovered ancestors who had fought, fled, or freed others. Social media gave voice to new generations who challenged old narratives and demanded visibility, honesty, and justice. But the struggle continues. Political polarization, culture wars, and misinformation have made history a battleground once more. There are those who seek to restrict how the Civil War and slavery are taught, claiming discomfort or patriotism as justification. There are those who would rather forget the war's causes, cling to sanitized myths, or insist on false equivalencies. The fight over how to remember the Civil War is, in many ways, a fight over what kind of nation America chooses to be. For the Civil War lives on not only in books and battlefields, but in the very structure of the nation, in the Constitution, in federalism, in the racial and regional divides that still shape American life. The echoes are unmistakable. The debates over states' rights, federal authority, civil rights, and voting access are all haunted by the Civil War's legacy. So too is the question of national identity. Who belongs, who decides, and who defines the story? And yet, amid all the complexity, pain, and unfinished business, there is also inspiration. The Civil War, at its core, was a crucible. It tested the American experiment as nothing had before or since. It forced a reckoning with the country's founding contradictions, liberty and slavery, equality and exclusion. And in the furnace of that war, new possibilities were forged: the abolition of slavery, birthright citizenship, equal protection under law. These were not perfect victories. They were incomplete, compromised, and constantly under threat. But they were real, and they remain the foundation upon which future progress must be built. The soldiers who marched in blue or gray, the enslaved who fled plantations to freedom, the women who wrote letters and ran farms, the abolitionists who risked all, the legislators who drafted amendments, the teachers who opened schools for freedmen, they have passed from this world, but their legacies endure. Every time America inches closer to its ideals, it does so in their shadow and in their honor. The war may be long over, but its meaning is still being written, not in blood, but in memory, in action, and in courage. Lincoln called upon the living to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which the dead had thus far so nobly advanced. That call remains. To remember the Civil War truthfully is to honor not just the pain and sacrifice, but the hope and vision that propelled it. It is to acknowledge that freedom is not a gift bestowed once and for all, but a prize earned and re-earned in each generation. It is to understand that the past is not past, not if it still shapes our laws, our politics, our identities. The Civil War's enduring legacy is not merely in what was won or lost, but in what remains to be done. And in that work, in that remembering, in that striving, the Union continues to be reborn. Part 11. Voices from the battlefield, letters, diaries, and the human cost of war. It is one thing to chart the Civil War through the sweeping movements of armies, the thunder of artillery, and the signatures on proclamations. It is another entirely to hear the tremble in a soldier's hand as he writes a final letter home by candlelight, to trace the ink smeared by a widow's tears, or to follow the delicate, determined script of a freedwoman learning to write her name for the first time. For all the generals and politicians who shaped its course, the Civil War was lived, endured, and remembered by ordinary people, by the men who marched, the women who waited, and the children who listened at the door for news that might never come. And it is in their words, in letters, diaries, poems, and prayers, that the true weight of the war is most vividly and painfully preserved. The story of the Civil War is not complete without them. These fragments of human experience, scribbled in foxholes and farmhouses, under tents and torchlight, in hospital wards and prison camps, form a counterpoint to the official record. They do not strategize. They feel. They suffer. They endure. And in their voices, the abstract concepts of patriotism, sacrifice, and honor are given flesh and breath. They speak of fear and love, of longing and grief, of boredom and horror, of laughter amid chaos and courage amid despair. They are the heartbeat of a war that otherwise risks becoming mere history. From the very first days of conflict, letters became the lifeline that connected the front to the home. As Union regiments assembled in the spring of 1861 and Confederate volunteers gathered in town squares, many carried with them not just muskets and haversacks, but pens and journals. Literacy, particularly in the North, was higher than at any previous point in American history, and the postal system worked with surprising efficiency, even amid the fog of war. In many ways, the Civil War was the first literate war in America's history, a conflict documented not only by journalists and official dispatches, but by those who lived it. Union Private Elisha Hunt Rhodes, whose diary would one day become a window into the life of a foot soldier, began his service in a spirit of boyish excitement. "I am a soldier of the Union," he wrote, "and proud of it." His early entries speak of comradeship and patriotism, of long marches and cold breakfasts. But as the war wore on, his tone grew graver. "This war is a cruel thing," he confessed after seeing the dead piled along the sunken road at Antietam. "I am tired of the sights and sounds of battle, but I shall go on to the end." In his words, we hear the erosion of innocence, the slow, steady toll that months of marching, fighting, and burying take on a young man's soul. Confederate artilleryman Robert Stiles, who survived Gettysburg and witnessed the fall of Richmond, kept a journal that mixed lyrical description with bitter reflection. "We were boys," he wrote, recalling his fellow gunners, "but we became men in the fields of fire." His writing, infused with a sense of doomed nobility, revealed a man torn between pride in his comrades and sorrow at the cause for which so many died. "Ours was a lost cause," he admitted years later, "and perhaps it was right that it be lost. But still I love them." Letters from home were no less vital and no less moving. Mothers, wives, and sweethearts poured their anxieties and affections into each carefully folded page. Some offered news of crops, of new births and deaths, of community rumors and church sermons. Others struggled to mask their dread with hope. "We are all well here," wrote Sarah Dawson to her husband in the Louisiana Infantry. "The baby speaks of you daily. I show him your picture and tell him Daddy is coming home." She did not tell him she had mortgaged their mule, or that their youngest had taken ill with fever. Among the most wrenching voices were those of the wounded and dying, who summoned extraordinary clarity and grace in their final words. One of the most famous examples comes from Major Sullivan Ballou of Rhode Island, who, knowing he might not survive the coming battle at Bull Run, penned a letter to his wife Sarah that still stirs the soul. "If I do not return, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I loved you. How great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the Revolution. My love for you is deathless." He was killed a week later. The letter never reached her until after his death. There are letters written with fingers missing, in hospitals where blood soaked the floors and groans filled the air. Others come from prison camps like Andersonville or Elmira, where starvation and disease were constant companions. They speak of lice and typhoid, of lost comrades and fleeting dreams. "I have not seen a green tree in 3 months," wrote a captured Union soldier. "I dream of rain and my mother's bread." For many, writing became a form of resistance, a way to maintain humanity amid inhuman conditions. Yet it was not only soldiers who wrote. Women, often dismissed from the central narrative of the war, produced some of its most vivid testimonies. Southern diarist Mary Chestnut chronicled the collapse of the Confederacy from within its social heart. Her diary swings between dry wit and furious indignation. She mocked pompous generals, grieved over friends lost, and described with unsparing honesty the contradictions of her world, a slave society declaring itself the champion of liberty. "We are clutching at straws," she wrote as Richmond burned, "and calling them pillars." Northern nurse Clara Barton, later founder of the American Red Cross, kept notes and letters that read like dispatches from hell. She tended to the wounded at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and beyond, often under fire. Her accounts speak of arms sawn off without anesthetic, of bullet wounds gone septic, of young boys moaning for their mothers. "The field was covered with them," she wrote after Fredericksburg. "Their cries were like a tide that would not ebb." Black Americans, too, left behind records that challenge and deepen our understanding of the war. Frederick Douglass, in letters and speeches, urged black men to enlist, calling the war a test of both union and humanity. "He who would be free must strike the blow," he said. Enslaved people who fled to Union lines, so-called contrabands, often learned to write in refugee camps, using their first letters to claim family, declare freedom, or demand wages. In the voice of a former slave named Jordan Anderson, who replied with withering irony to a request from his old master to return to the plantation, we hear a new voice, confident, free, and no longer afraid. "If you will send me my wages for the time I served you," he wrote, "I will consider your proposition." Children, too, witnessed the war with eyes that saw more than they should have. In notebooks and letters, they recorded cannon fire in the distance, the absence of fathers, the arrival of bodies in wagons. 10-year-old Carrie Berry of Atlanta wrote, "We had to go in the cellar because the Yankees were shelling the town. I held Mama's hand, and we sang hymns." Her innocence, unbroken yet shadowed, is among the war's most haunting notes. Even in death, voices persisted. Soldiers sometimes tucked letters into their pockets before battle, marked, "To be sent if I fall." Others scrawled notes in blood or scratched words into rocks and beams. In mass graves at Shiloh and Cold Harbor, some were found clutching pieces of paper with names, prayers, or the word mother. The act of writing became, in some cases, the last assertion of personhood, a defiance of anonymity in the face of obliteration. The cumulative effect of these writings is staggering. While battle reports may tell us who won and who lost, these personal narratives reveal what the war cost, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. They expose not just the horror of combat, but the slow grind of loneliness, the burden of duty, the resilience of love. They teach us that history is not made only by grand decisions, but also by small acts, by a soldier choosing to write instead of sleep, by a mother lighting a lamp to read a letter by moonlight. And they remind us that grief is a universal language. Whether Union or Confederate, black or white, man or woman, child or elder, the writers of the Civil War share something timeless: the desperate need to be heard, remembered, and understood. Their words transcend ideology and geography. They are not propaganda or polemic. They are confessions, whispers, cries, and sometimes songs. After the war, many of these letters and diaries were saved in attics, passed down through families, or donated to archives. Some became part of the national memory, others were lost forever. But in recent decades, historians and archivists have worked tirelessly to recover them, digitize them, and bring them back into public light. They now sit in libraries, museums, and online databases, allowing new generations to encounter the war not as abstraction, but as lived reality. And what do we hear when we listen? We hear courage and contradiction. We hear laughter amid death, faith amid ruin, hatred and hope in unequal measure. We hear the story of a nation learning, through agony, who it was and what it wanted to be. And perhaps most of all, we hear that the past is not silent. It speaks to us still, if only we have the ears and the heart to listen. In the end, the Civil War's legacy is not only preserved in monuments or taught in textbooks. It lives on in these fragile pages, in the ink that time has not yet erased. The men and women who wrote them may be gone, but their words endure, testaments to a time when America came apart, and to the human voices that sought to hold it together. Part 12. Ironclads, Rifles, and the New Face of War, Technology and Tactics in the Civil War. They came not expecting the future, but carrying the weight of the past. The armies that marched into battle in 1861 did so with the manners, strategies, and assumptions of another age. A Napoleonic vision of cavalry charges, linear formations, and the romantic gallop of drums and banners beneath the open sky. They came with muskets that billowed smoke but often missed, with cannons meant for open fields, and officers who had memorized textbooks drawn from European wars of maneuver and order. What they met instead was the horrifying dawn of modern warfare, a conflict transformed by industrial might, ruthless innovation, and a kind of mechanical ingenuity that neither side fully anticipated. The American Civil War was, in more ways than one, a war of transformation. And nowhere is that clearer than in its weapons, its machines, and the shifting art of how men fought and died. This was the war that gave us the ironclad and the repeating rifle, the telegraph and the trench, the observation balloon and the railroad. A war in which technology outpaced doctrine, where commanders struggled to adapt to the deadly realities wrought by industrial-age killing tools. It was a war where the destructive power of the modern world emerged from smoke and iron, signaling an end to the old order of warfare and the brutal birth of a new one. The story begins with the rifled musket, a seemingly modest evolution that changed everything. Prior to the Civil War, most soldiers used smoothbore muskets with limited range and accuracy. But with the widespread adoption of the Springfield Model 1861 and its Confederate cousin, the Richmond rifle, the battlefield was transformed. These rifled weapons, especially when paired with the conical mini-ball, were accurate up to 300 yards or more, 3 times the effective range of earlier muskets. They were slower to load than later breech loaders, but their accuracy meant that traditional line infantry tactics, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder and fired in volleys, now delivered slaughter instead of strategy. Suddenly, The open field was a killing field. Infantry that once marched with pride into battle now dropped like wheat beneath the scythe. Officers clinging to outdated tactics found their men decimated before they could even fire a shot. At battles like Fredericksburg and Cold Harbor, wave after wave of men were mowed down before ever reaching the enemy line. It became a war of entrenchment, of breastworks and ditches, of cover and concealment, features that would later define the killing grounds of World War I. But it wasn't just small arms that changed. Artillery, too, evolved. The introduction of rifled cannon like the Parrott and the James guns allowed for greater range and precision. Explosive shells replaced solid shot, tearing men apart and turning fortifications into kindling. The Napoleonic era's reliance on massed troops and grand charges gave way to staggered lines, sharpshooters, and firepower dominance. The battlefield grew deadlier and more chaotic, the air filled not just with the crack of musketry, but with the whistling of shells and the thunderclap of exploding caissons. Nowhere was innovation more dramatically realized than at sea. When the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads in March 1862, cobbled together from the burned-out hull of the USS Merrimack and clad in iron plating, it rendered wooden warships obsolete in a single afternoon. The Virginia smashed through the Union blockade like a hammer through glass, sinking the USS Cumberland and battering the USS Congress into submission. The wooden navies of the past were powerless before its armor and firepower. But the Revolution did not go unanswered. The Union had its own ace, the USS Monitor, a strange, low-lying vessel with a single rotating turret and an armored hull that rode just inches above the waves. When the Monitor met the Virginia the following day, the clash was less a naval battle and more a duel between machines of a new era. Cannonballs bounced from iron hulls, the ships circling one another like wary beasts, smoke and steam swirling around them. Though the battle ended in stalemate, the implications were seismic. Naval warfare had changed forever. Ironclads were the future. The age of sail had ended in the smoke of Hampton Roads. Beyond weapons, logistics were revolutionized. The North's rail network became a vital artery of war, carrying men and material across hundreds of miles at unprecedented speed. The Confederacy, with fewer rails and even fewer replacements, struggled to match. Trains became mobile lifelines and targets alike. In the East and West, commanders began coordinating their movements with the precision of timetables, learning to think in terms of steel and speed. The Union's ability to mobilize, supply, and reinforce using railroads became a decisive advantage, allowing Grant to push his campaigns forward in a relentless tempo the South could not easily answer. Even more revolutionary, though less glamorous, was the use of the telegraph. For the first time in history, generals and political leaders could communicate across vast distances almost instantly. Lincoln, seated in the War Department's telegraph office, often received battlefield reports mere minutes after the events occurred. Telegraph lines strung along railroads became essential tools of command and coordination. Though not without delays and misinterpretations, the telegraph allowed for real-time strategy and command flexibility unthinkable in earlier wars. It was, in essence, the Internet of the 1860s, a technology that shrank the nation's sense of space and time. In the skies, too, innovation took flight, literally. The Union Army Balloon Corps, led by Aeronaut Thaddeus Lowe, deployed hydrogen-filled balloons to observe enemy positions from above. Tethered to the ground and connected by telegraph lines, these balloons provided reconnaissance that was decades ahead of its time. Though cumbersome and ultimately sidelined due to logistical challenges and vulnerability to enemy fire, The use of aerial observation foreshadowed the modern era of surveillance and aerial combat. But for all these innovations, the war remained brutally human. Technology extended reach and lethality, but it did not lessen suffering. If anything, it increased it. The new weapons maimed as often as they killed, and medical science lagged far behind. Amputation became the most common surgical procedure, performed often without anesthesia or antiseptic. Infection was rampant. Bullets shattered bone beyond repair, and shrapnel tore flesh beyond recognition. A soldier wounded by a rifled musket or explosive shell faced not only agony, but often a slow and ignominious death. Yet amid this hell, men adapted. Sharpshooters emerged as a new breed of soldier, operating in pairs and taking deadly shots from concealed positions. Units like Burden's sharpshooters in the Union Army wore green uniforms for camouflage and carried specialized rifles. On both sides, trench warfare became increasingly common. At Petersburg, elaborate networks of trenches, redoubts, and tunnels turned the battlefield into a foreshadowing of the Western Front in World War I. The famous Battle of the Crater, in which Union forces detonated a massive mine beneath Confederate lines only to botch the follow-up assault, exemplified both the promise and peril of technological innovation without tactical forethought. Meanwhile, the very structure of warfare was shifting. The scale of the armies, the duration of the campaigns, and the complexity of coordination required new ways of thinking. The old model of decisive, short wars gave way to attrition and total mobilization. Civilian infrastructure became fair game, especially under leaders like Sherman, whose march to the sea was as much a psychological and logistical campaign as a military one. War was no longer confined to battlefields. It touched every aspect of life. The Civil War also redefined who could be a combatant. Technological and industrial demands brought women into factories and hospitals in unprecedented numbers. The war's sheer scale and appetite for manpower led to the enlistment of black soldiers, most famously in the 54th Massachusetts, who fought not only for the Union but for dignity and a stake in the nation's future. Technology helped enable their participation through printing presses, telegraph messages, and recruitment posters, but it was their courage that gave it meaning. And as the war neared its close, the lessons of technology became impossible to ignore. Commanders like Grant and Sherman understood that wars of this new kind would not be won through elegance, but through endurance. Victory would come not through a single battle, but through the grinding application of superior logistics, relentless coordination, and the ruthless deployment of industrial might. By 1865, the war had devoured over 600,000 lives, and the means by which it was fought had transformed forever the nature of armed conflict. The breech-loading rifle, the repeating carbine, the ironclad ship, the trench, the telegraph, the railroad, all were now standard tools of war. The lessons, written in blood and innovation, would be studied by generals for generations. Indeed, European observers like the Prussian Captain Justus Skybert took detailed notes from the battlefields of Virginia, applying them decades later in wars yet to come. The war that began with parades and sabers ended with smoke and steel. The men who charged with flags held high came to crawl through mud and dig with bayonets. And the country they fought for, however divided, emerged not just politically altered, but fundamentally modernized. The Civil War did not merely decide the fate of a union. It marked the moment when the old world of war was left behind and the modern world, in all its terrifying potential, began to rise. And as the echoes of cannon fire faded and the last veterans grew old, it became clear that something profound had shifted, not only in the nation, but in the very nature of war itself. Part 13. The Civilians' War, Daily Life, Displacement, and Descent on the Home Front. While armies clashed and cannons thundered across the blood-soaked fields of Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh, another kind of war raged far from the front lines, quieter, perhaps, but no less enduring. It was fought in kitchens and on porches, in newspapers and town halls, in factories, fields, and family parlors. The Civil War was not just a contest of soldiers and strategy. It was a total war that reached deep into the homes of civilians, touching every life, shaping every choice, and leaving no corner of the divided nation untouched. It was a war of loss and longing, of survival and suspicion, of resilience and resistance. It was a civilians' war, and it changed the American home front forever. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the cities and towns of both North and South erupted with patriotic fervor. Parades swept through main streets, flags waved from every window, and speeches called for sacrifice and valor. Young men rushed to enlist, often cheered on by family and friends, swept up in the promise of glory and the romance of cause. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, that romantic veil began to wear thin. The war's brutal reality crept inexorably into the daily rhythms of life, turning joy into anxiety and hope into heartbreak. In the North, the industrial heartland roared to life, transformed almost overnight into an engine of war. Women who had never before worked outside the home now filled the textile mills and munitions factories, stitching uniforms and packing cartridges. In cities like Lowell, Philadelphia, and Chicago, war production became the pulse of civic life. The same was true of small-town workshops and sprawling rail yards, places where hammers rang and furnaces glowed, feeding the Union's insatiable need for arms and supplies. Women took on new burdens, running farms and businesses in their husbands' absence. They formed aid societies, organized sanitary commissions, and raised funds for hospitals. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, founded in 1861, became a lifeline for wounded soldiers, distributing supplies and improving the often filthy conditions of army camps. Behind this effort stood legions of women, sewing, cooking, writing letters, and collecting donations with tireless devotion. For many, it was an awakening, a call to civic engagement that would shape the rising suffrage movement in the decades to come. But the North was not immune to division. War weariness grew with each new casualty list, each telegram bearing grim tidings. In the cities, especially among immigrant communities, resentment simmered. Why? Many asked, should they die for a war they did not start? Why should the sons of Irish dockworkers or German artisans be drafted to fight a war many saw as a conflict of elites and abolitionists? That resentment exploded in July 1863 during the New York City draft riots, one of the bloodiest civil disturbances in American history. Sparked by the Enrollment Act's provision allowing the wealthy to buy their way out of service, thousands of working-class men, many Irish, took to the streets. What began as protest quickly devolved into chaos. Mobs attacked draft offices, looted businesses, and turned their fury on black citizens, scapegoated as the cause of a war they never asked for. Over 4 days, at least 120 people were killed, and thousands more fled the city. The army, fresh from Gettysburg, had to be deployed to restore order. The riots were a searing reminder that the North's home front, for all its might, was not united in purpose or in heart. In the South, the experience of civilian life was even more harrowing. From the earliest days of the war, the Confederacy struggled with supply shortages, blockades, and internal discord. The Union's naval blockade, its Anaconda plan, slowly strangled southern ports, cutting off trade and creating a cascade of shortages. Basic goods, coffee, salt, cloth, and medicine, became precious commodities. Inflation soared. Confederate currency lost its value, and with it, the ability of ordinary people to buy food or shoes or candles. Southern women bore the brunt of these privations. They found themselves not only managing homes without husbands, but trying to feed families in towns where shelves were bare and prices skyrocketing. In Richmond, Atlanta, and countless smaller towns, bread riots erupted as women, desperate and hungry, stormed stores and government warehouses. They demanded food, protested prices, and challenged Confederate authority with raw, maternal rage. In March 1863, a mob of armed women in Richmond, many of them soldiers' wives, confronted Governor John Letcher and raided local shops. Jefferson Davis himself appeared, attempting to calm the crowd. When words failed, he threatened force. Meanwhile, slaves across the South waged a quiet revolution of their own. With masters off at war and the future uncertain, many took the opportunity to resist. They slowed work, sabotaged equipment, and fled plantations in growing numbers. Thousands made their way to Union lines, braving unimaginable risks for the promise of freedom. For the Confederacy, the loss of enslaved laborers was a devastating blow, not only to agriculture, but to morale. Each escaped slave was a strike against the Southern war effort and a silent testimony to the crumbling foundations of slavery. The war's chaos also unleashed displacement on an enormous scale. As armies moved and battles raged, civilians were often caught in the crossfire. Entire towns became ghostly shells. In Tennessee, Virginia, and along the Mississippi, families fled their homes with little more than what they could carry. Refugees, white and black, wandered the countryside, seeking safety amid the ruins. For enslaved people who escaped, the path to freedom was perilous. Contraband camps, hastily constructed by Union forces, often lacked sufficient food, shelter, and medical care. Disease was rampant. But despite the hardship, these camps symbolized something profound, a new world struggling to be born. Not all civilians endured the war passively. Across both North and South, dissent found its voice in newspapers, sermons, and secret meetings. In the North, Copperheads, anti-war Democrats, decried Lincoln's policies, opposed the draft, and called for peace with the South. Some were motivated by racism, others by constitutional concerns or sheer exhaustion. Newspapers like the Chicago Times railed against the administration, accusing Lincoln of tyranny and military overreach. The president, in turn, suspended habeas corpus in certain areas, and hundreds were arrested for suspected disloyalty. In the South, opposition simmered in mountain communities and among the poor, especially in regions like East Tennessee and western North Carolina, where Unionist sentiment was strong. Confederate deserters hid in the hills, and guerrilla warfare erupted in some areas. The Confederate government, increasingly authoritarian, cracked down on internal dissent, but could not silence it entirely. Religion offered solace and fuel for the fire. Clergy on both sides preached sermons of divine purpose. In the North, abolitionist ministers cast the war as a moral crusade, a second American Revolution destined to cleanse the nation of slavery. In the South, preachers spoke of a righteous struggle for independence, likening the Confederacy to the Israelites in exile. But as the war dragged on and suffering deepened, faith was tested. Churches became sites of mourning, and pastors struggled to reconcile carnage with providence. Amid this atmosphere of sorrow and uncertainty, personal letters became lifelines. Civilians wrote to soldiers at the front with aching regularity, sending news, prayers, small tokens of love. And the soldiers, when they could, wrote back. These letters, by the millions, formed a vast and intimate archive of emotion, hope, fear, longing, and above all, connection. In their inked lines, one finds the true texture of the home front, not the grand narratives of politics or strategy, but the daily, deeply human struggle to endure. And then there were the children, too young to fight, yet shaped forever by the war's shadow. They grew up with the sound of drumbeats and casualty lists, with absent fathers and missing brothers. In both Union and Confederate households, children were pressed into labor or caretaking. Some witnessed battles firsthand, others bore the trauma of refugee camps and destroyed homes. They emerged from the war with a premature wisdom, a hardened resilience, and stories that would echo across generations. By 1865, the civilian population of the United States, North and South, was profoundly changed. The economy had shifted, gender roles had evolved, and political divisions had deepened. Women, having taken on new roles and responsibilities, would not easily return to silence. Free people, having tasted liberty, would not surrender it without a fight. Immigrants, veterans, and the working poor demanded recognition and reform. The war had tested every thread in the fabric of American society, and many had snapped. The civilians' war was not fought with rifles or sabers, but with grit, grief, and unyielding will. It was fought in sacrifice and suffering, in quiet courage and unrecognized endurance. It was a war of waiting and weeping, of rationed books and sewing needles, of protest and perseverance. It was, in every sense, a war of the people, and its legacy, like that of the soldiers who marched and died, would shape the soul of the nation long after the final battle had been fought. Part 14. A New Birth of Freedom, the Civil War's Enduring Legacy in Modern America. In the final flickering twilight of the Civil War, amid the ashes of ruined cities and the silence of fields once thunderous with cannon fire, a new sound began to rise. Not the roar of guns, but the quiet, tentative murmur of a nation trying to understand what it had become. The war was over, the armies disbanded, the bloodied flags furled and stored away. But peace, though declared, was fragile. The Union had been preserved, but the cost was immense. More than 700,000 dead. A society transformed. A question still unanswered. What kind of nation had emerged from the crucible? The American Civil War did not end with surrender. It reverberated. It echoed down through generations, shaping the very bones of the country's identity. In courthouse decisions and school books, in public monuments and private diaries, in movements for freedom and justice, in the very air of the American political and cultural consciousness, the war left an indelible mark. It did not simply resolve the fate of a union, it birthed a modern America. As the guns fell silent in 1865, the first challenge was memory. How would a divided nation remember what had happened, and more importantly, why it had happened? In the North, the war was quickly sanctified as a moral victory, a righteous crusade that had preserved democracy and ended slavery. Lincoln's words at Gettysburg, "A new birth of freedom," became a guiding light. But even as the North celebrated Union victory, the wounds were deep, the costs painful. For every parade or monument, there were widows, orphans, broken soldiers hobbling home with empty sleeves or hollow eyes. And behind the triumph, a profound anxiety. Could a republic, so nearly destroyed, truly endure? In the South, the memory took a different shape. The pain of defeat was immense, not merely military, but existential. Cities had been reduced to rubble. The slave economy, once the bedrock of wealth and power, had collapsed. The proud sons of the Confederacy returned to burned plantations and broken dreams. Amid this devastation, a myth was born, a myth that would become one of the most enduring and dangerous legacies of the war. It was the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause painted the Confederate struggle as noble, gallant, and tragically doomed, not about slavery, but about honor, states' rights, and resistance to tyranny. It recast Southern generals like Robert E. Lee as chivalric heroes, pure in heart and noble in defeat. It minimized the brutality of slavery, often portraying enslaved people as loyal or content. It was a powerful narrative, and for generations, it shaped textbooks, films, and public memory. The monuments that rose across the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not mere markers. They were declarations, cast in bronze and granite, of how the war would be remembered and by whom. Yet even as these conflicting memories hardened, other legacies were unfolding, tangible, far-reaching, and often wrenching in their consequences. The abolition of slavery, achieved at such staggering cost, did not usher in an era of equality. Instead, Reconstruction brought a brief, dazzling flash of hope, followed by betrayal, violence, and retreat. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enshrined freedom, citizenship, and voting rights in the Constitution. For a fleeting moment, the South saw black legislators, schools, newspapers, and institutions bloom. It was a new America, radical, defiant, unfinished. But the backlash was swift and merciless. White supremacist terror, in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and countless other vigilante groups, swept across the South. Black Americans were beaten, lynched, and driven from polling places. Federal troops were withdrawn, political will eroded, and the dream of multiracial democracy was crushed under the weight of Jim Crow. In this betrayal, the Civil War's promises remained unfulfilled. The struggle for equality would not end in 1865. It would ignite again and again in new forms, from Selma to Ferguson, from the pulpit of Dr. King to the protests of the 21st century. And yet, even in the darkest moments, the legacy of the Civil War burned like an ember, refusing to be extinguished. It shaped the very structure of government, strengthening the federal system over the states, asserting the primacy of national unity. It reshaped the military, introducing the concept of total war and laying the foundations for the vast, modern American military-industrial complex. It changed the meaning of freedom, expanding it from a legal abstraction into a lived, contested reality. It transformed the role of the presidency, elevating the executive office in times of national crisis. It gave the nation, for the first time, a truly national cemetery system and a new relationship with death, mourning, and commemoration. But perhaps its most profound legacy lies in the cultural soul of the nation. The war inspired poets, painters, filmmakers, and novelists. It gave us the red badge of courage, Gone with the Wind, and Glory. It haunted the pens of Walt Whitman and Ambrose Bierce, echoed in the jazz of New Orleans and the blues of Mississippi. Its battlefields became sacred ground, visited by millions. Its heroes, villains, and martyrs entered the American pantheon. It became not just history, but myth. At the same time, the war remained contested terrain. In the 20th century, civil rights activists pointed to the unrealized promises of emancipation, invoking the war's unfinished work. Martin Luther King Jr., in his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech, stood in the shadow of Lincoln's monument and declared that the Emancipation Proclamation was a promissory note, yet to be honored. The Civil War, in this light, was not past. It was present, a battlefield of meaning still being fought. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that battlefield of memory reached fever pitch. Debates erupted over Confederate monuments, school curricula, and the naming of military bases. Some called for preserving history, others for correcting it. Museums rewrote exhibits. Statues came down. Voices long silenced began to shape the narrative. Voices of black soldiers, enslaved women, abolitionists, and ordinary people who had endured the war's wrath without glory or recognition. In all this, the Civil War remained a mirror, sometimes brutal, sometimes inspiring, held up to the American soul. It asked who we were and who we are. It asked what freedom means and who gets to enjoy it. It revealed, again and again, the unfinished nature of the American experiment. Even now, the war lives on. In the language of politics, in the battles over voting rights, in the cultural fault lines between rural and urban, north and south, black and white. In 2020, amid a national reckoning over race, Confederate monuments became flashpoints once more. The echoes of 1861 could be heard in the chants of protesters, in the clamor of legislatures, in the gaze of a divided nation staring into its past, searching for its future. Yet amid the noise, there is hope. Because the war also gave us Lincoln's vision, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It gave us the Emancipation Proclamation, flawed but revolutionary. It gave us the 13th Amendment, the truest legal expression of liberty in American law. It gave us a template for transformation, not perfect, not complete, but enduring. In the cemeteries of Antietam, Vicksburg, and Andersonville, in the quiet of Shiloh and the hills of Chattanooga, the dead do not speak. But the land does. It tells a story of sacrifice, of horror, of courage, and of change. Each generation that visits must ask anew what the war means, what it demands, and how its legacy is honored or denied. The American Civil War was not just a war between states or a conflict over slavery and sovereignty. It was a crucible in which the nation's deepest ideals were tested by its darkest impulses. It shattered illusions and forged truths. It created a union not just of geography, but of purpose, imperfect, evolving, but forever marked by what it survived. In that long arc of history, the war's truest legacy is not found in statues or battle maps, but in the ongoing struggle for justice, the quest for unity, and the stubborn, beautiful, maddening hope that America can be, in Lincoln's words, the last best hope of earth. This was the legacy of the Civil War, not merely the birth of a new freedom, but the perpetual, relentless effort to make that freedom real, for all people, in every generation. It is a legacy unfinished, but alive. Echoes of Valor, the Civil War in American Memory and Myth. Long after the smoke cleared from the battlefields and the uniforms of blue and gray had been folded into cedar chests or mounted in dusty museums, the Civil War lived on, not in cannon fire or cavalry charges, but in the minds, myths, and memories of generations that followed. It became a war not just of muskets and maneuver, but of meaning. It left behind no peace treaty, no single triumph to be sealed in a capital or toasted in a drawing room. Instead, it left a legacy that bled into every aspect of American life. The Civil War did not end. It was remembered, and in that remembrance, it was reborn again and again. The soldiers who fought it knew this truth better than most. As the decades wore on, survivors of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Chickamauga gathered at annual reunions, clutching old photographs and sharing stories now softened by age. They erected monuments not just to commemorate, but to assert memory. On the same fields where comrades had fallen, bronze sentinels were raised in honor of the dead. These statues did more than mark graves. They narrated history. In their solemn expressions and heroic poses, they told Americans how to remember. But whose story did they tell? In the North, the war was remembered as the preservation of a great democratic experiment, the triumph of union and liberty over rebellion and bondage. Northern memorials emphasized sacrifice for the cause of national unity, often linking Union victory with the abolition of slavery. Abraham Lincoln became the embodiment of this vision, a martyr president whose death symbolized the tragic cost of moral progress. The Gettysburg Address, short and solemn, echoed through classrooms and political speeches as a sacred invocation of American ideals. In the South, however, the story unfolded differently. There, amid the ashes of cities and the lingering bitterness of defeat, the war became something else, a tale of heroism and tragedy, of noble struggle and lost glory. The lost cause emerged not merely as an interpretation of the past, but as an entire cultural framework. It recast the Confederacy's aims as honorable, even chivalrous, and downplayed or outright erased the central role of slavery. Southern generals were venerated as saints of a holy crusade, none more so than Robert E. Lee, whose image, stoic, noble, tragic, was carved into stone and legend alike. This myth found fertile soil in a South eager to reclaim a sense of pride and identity. Monuments sprouted across town squares and courthouse lawns, not during or immediately after the war, but decades later, often at the height of racial tension during the Jim Crow era. These statues did not simply remember, they asserted dominance. They became tools of social control, silent sentinels over a racial order that echoed the very cause the Confederacy had championed. And yet, for many Americans, North and South, these interpretations coexisted uncomfortably, entangled in a national story that prized both unity and freedom, heroism and equality. Textbooks sanitized slavery. History books praised Lincoln while leonizing Lee. Hollywood joined the chorus. Films like The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind painted the antebellum South in soft hues and presented Reconstruction as a dark time of chaos and black misrule. These narratives, wildly popular, shaped the consciousness of millions. Still, even within this divided memory, new voices emerged. Black Americans, long marginalized from the official story, began to reclaim their place within it. Historians, activists, and artists challenged the lost cause myth, insisting on a truer, fuller telling. They pointed to the heroism of the United States colored troops, who fought and died for a union that often failed to recognize their humanity. They resurrected the voices of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth, not as footnotes, but as central figures in the nation's transformation. As the 20th century progressed, the war's legacy continued to reverberate through each new chapter of American life. During World War I and World War II, the imagery of the Civil War was evoked to stir patriotism, to remind Americans of the costs of freedom. During the Cold War, it served as proof that democracy could survive even its darkest hour. But it was during the Civil Rights Movement that the past returned most vividly. Protesters marched past Confederate monuments. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a dream rooted in the promises made, then broken, during and after the war. In that moment, the Civil War's memory was no longer frozen in time. It became a call to action, and so the battles over memory intensified. In the South, states incorporated Confederate symbols into flags, asserting heritage while opponents decried hate. School curriculums became battlegrounds. Historical sites wrestled with how to present slavery, secession, and the broader context of the war. Public discourse grew louder, more charged. What had once been quiet arguments in academic journals spilled into city council meetings and national headlines. In the early 21st century, this struggle reached a fever pitch. Tragedies like the 2015 mass shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and the 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, centered around the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue, forced a reckoning. The statues that had stood for decades suddenly became sites of protest, of violence, of urgent debate. The past had returned with a vengeance, and Americans could no longer avoid the question, what exactly were they remembering? Even as some clung to heritage narratives, others tore down the myths with zeal. Confederate monuments were removed by vote, by court order, or by hand. Streets were renamed. History was rewritten not in the sense of falsehood, but of correction. Museums transformed. Battlefields began to tell more inclusive stories of enslaved people, of women, of those whose voices had been silenced for generations. And still, the Civil War echoed. It echoed in political rhetoric, as leaders invoked Lincoln or Jefferson Davis. It echoed in regional identity, in accents, flags, and the very names of towns. It echoed in race relations, in ongoing debates over policing, voting rights, and systemic inequality. It echoed in the fierce attachment to the Constitution, to the idea of state sovereignty, and to the suspicion of centralized power. It echoed in the simple, enduring division of North and South, not just as geography, but as cultural poles. Yet through all the division, one unshakable fact remained. The Civil War was America's crucible. It forced a reckoning over slavery, union, and democracy. It proved that the nation could bend, nearly break, and still survive. It birthed the modern United States, not as a perfect union, but as a striving one. In literature and art, the war retained its tragic grandeur. Writers from Shelby Foote to Toni Morrison, filmmakers from Ken Burns to Ava DuVernay, reinterpreted its meaning for new generations. Folk songs, bluegrass ballads, and gospel hymns carried its sorrows forward. Reenactors walked the same fields, their boots stirring the same dust. The dead were still mourned, still honored. Ultimately, the memory of the Civil War is not fixed. It evolves. It is challenged, reconsidered, reinterpreted. Each generation rediscovers it through its own lens, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as warning. In classrooms, courtrooms, and street protests, the question endures, what does the Civil War mean? What did it achieve? What, in the end, does it demand of us? The answer lies not just in the past, but in the future. The war's legacy is not merely in its battles, its politics, or even its emancipation. Its truest legacy is the conversation it compels, the constant, necessary dialogue about who we are, what we value, and how we reckon with our own contradictions. The Civil War teaches us that liberty is never final, that unity is never guaranteed, and that the promise of America must be renewed, again and again, through struggle and sacrifice. And so the echoes of valor continue. In the silence of memorials, in the chants of protesters, in the speeches of presidents and the cries of the forgotten, the Civil War still speaks. It calls us not just to remember, but to understand. Not just to honor, but to act. Not just to weep for the past, but to shape a future worthy of the lives lost. This was not simply a war between brothers. It was a reckoning for a nation. A war whose shadow falls not behind us, but across every step we take forward. And with that, the story does not end. It lives on. In you, in me, in the unfinished journey of a country still learning how to be whole.